If you close your eyes and listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of the wind before it had anything to break against. A time when the vast interior of the American West was not a map of territories, states, and county lines, but a green, undulating ocean of prairie grass that seemed to stretch into the very spine of the sky. It was a quiet so absolute that a human voice felt like an intrusion, a temporary ripple on a surface that had remained undisturbed for thousands of winters. For centuries, this landscape existed in a state of rhythmic patience, defined by the seasonal migrations of the buffalo, the deep, rumbling summer thunderstorms that set the horizon ablaze, and the long, freezing silences of the northern plains. But change, when it finally arrived, did not approach with a slow, measured step. It arrived like a flash flood, a sudden, chaotic deluge of iron, wood, canvas, and human ambition, driven by the insatiable hunger for land. The land rush transformed this quiet ocean almost overnight, shattering the ancient stillness with the sound of thousands of heavy wagon wheels, the frantic cloop-cloop of horses driven to exhaustion, and the sharp, metallic ring of surveyors' stakes being driven deep into the ancient sod. You must imagine yourself standing on a low ridge in the late afternoons of the late 19th century, watching the dust storm raised by 10,000 homesteaders as they raced across the newly opened territories. To the untrained eye, it looked like a grand adventure, a heroic march of progress where families sought a fresh start and a piece of earth to call their own. But if you look a little closer, past the fluttering flags of the land seekers and the heavy oxen straining against their yokes, you begin to see the true nature of the frontier. It was a place of deep, profound isolation, an environment that stripped away the comforting illusions of civilization and left men and women entirely exposed to the elements and to the darker corners of their own nature. The promise of free land was a powerful narcotic, drawing people from the crowded tenements of New York, the exhausted farmlands of New England, and the war-torn villages of Europe. They arrived with high hopes and empty pockets, believing that a quarter section of dirt could cure whatever it was that ailed their souls. Yet, for every family that cleared the brush and built a sod house with their own blistered hands, there were hundreds of men who came without a plow, without a family, and without the slightest intention of turning over the earth. These were the transients, the drift logs of a changing continent. They were railroad laborers who spent their days swinging heavy sledgehammers under a blistering sun, miners with dust lunged who chased the faint whisper of silver in the creek beds, cowboys who spent months staring at the rear ends of cattle, and speculators looking to turn a quick profit on a town lot that existed only as a drawing on a piece of greasy parchment. These men were profoundly, devastatingly lonely. They were cut off from the stabilizing influences of mothers, sisters, and wives, living in an entirely masculine world where the only constants were hard labor, bad food, and the heavy, suffocating weight of the western horizon. It was into this raw, unsettled vacuum that a different kind of pioneer stepped. A woman who did not carry a spinning wheel or a bag of seed corn, but who possessed a keen understanding of the human ledger, and an unwavering eye for real estate. To understand the life of a frontier brothel madam, you must first discard the myths created by the dime novels and the cheap theatrical shows of the era. She was not a tragic figure pinning away in a dark corner, nor was she the brassy, heart-of-gold caricature that would later populate the moving pictures. In the reality of the land rush, a successful madam was, first and foremost, a pragmatic entrepreneur, an executive operating in a high-risk, high-reward environment where the laws were written by the powerful and enforced by the fickle. She was often a woman who had found the traditional paths of 19th century womanhood to be a form of slow, respectable suffocating. Marriage in the East often meant legal non-existence, a life of endless domestic labor under the absolute authority of a husband, with no right to her own wages, her own property, or her own future. On the frontier, however, the very chaos that broke weaker spirits provided a strange, perilous kind of freedom for a woman with a cool head and a steady hand. Consider the arrival of a woman we might call Madame Sarah. Though her real name changed with every state line she crossed, a common habit among those who wished to keep their past safely buried beneath the dust of the trail. She had watched the gold rushes of California fade into corporate mining conglomerates. She had seen the wild cattle towns of Kansas grow respectable and dull. And now, as the government prepared to open up millions of acres of tribal land to the highest bidder or the fastest horse, she saw one last opportunity to build an empire of her own. She did not participate in the frantic race when the cavalry pistols fired at noon to signal the start of the land run. She did not need to gallop across the prairie on a half-broke stallion to claim a quarter section of creek bottom. Instead, she arrived 3 days later, riding comfortably in the back of a heavy freight wagon, sitting atop crates of imported glassware, rolls of velvet carpet, and barrels of high-grade Kentucky bourbon. She understood that while the homesteaders were busy fighting over the date, the real wealth would accumulate where the crowd gathered to spend the evenings. When you look at the town site she chose, it is hard to believe that a city would ever rise from such a desolate patch of earth. It was a place where 2 railroad lines crossed, a dusty junction where the steam engines stopped to take on water and coal. There were no trees to shield the eyes from the glare of the sun, no paved streets to keep the mud from swallowing a boot hole. There was only a vast, sprawling city of canvas. Thousands of tents of every size and description, pitched haphazardly along paths that would eventually become avenues. The air was thick with the smell of greenwood smoke, roasting coffee beans, the pungent odor of unwashed mules, and the sharp, vinegar scent of cheap whiskey rotting in wooden casks. The sound was an endless, confusing din. The shouting of teamsters, the barking of stray dogs, the rhythmic thud of axes clearing the scrub oak, and the constant, murmuring undercurrent of thousands of male voices, talking of land, gold, and the homes they had left behind. Madame Sarah did not waste time complaining about the dust or the lack of proper lumber. She bought a premium lot within walking distance of the railroad depot, paying a desperate speculator 3 times what it was worth in gold coin, because she knew that convenience was the first secret of commerce. Within 48 hours, her own structure had risen among the tents. It was what the locals called a canvas palace, a massive 60-foot tent supported by heavy cedar poles, with a floor made of rough-sawn pine planks that had been hauled 60 miles from the nearest sawmill. To the men who walked past, its exterior looked no different from the temporary warehouses of the land companies or the crowded barracks of the railroad crews. But once you stepped through the double canvas flaps, leaving the blinding glare of the prairie noon behind, you entered a world that had been carefully, deliberately engineered to alter your senses. Inside, the light was soft, filtered through the thick, cream-colored canvas roof and augmented by the warm, amber glow of half a dozen polished brass kerosene lamps hanging from the center ridge poles. The smell of the frontier, the dust, the mules, the raw sweat of desperate labor, was replaced by a complex, intoxicating aroma. It was a mixture of imported Turkish tobacco, sweet almond oil, lavender water, and the rich, comforting scent of fresh pine sawdust scattered thick across the floorboards to catch the mud from the street. At the far end of the tent stood a long, heavy counter made of dark walnut, polished until it reflected the lamplight like a quiet pool of water. Behind it sat rows of glass bottles with labels that whispered of civilization. Green glass from France, amber bottles from the distilleries of Louisville, and clear flasks of gin that promised a quick escape from the reality of the prairie. This canvas palace was not merely a place of business, it was a sanctuary of illusion. The men who came through the door were often exhausted to the very bone. Their hands were raw from tearing up the stubborn prairie sod, their eyes red from the constant, wind-driven dust that found its way through every seam of their clothing. They had spent days or weeks sleeping on the hard ground under a greasy blanket, eating nothing but salt pork and hardtack, with no company but their own anxious thoughts. When they stepped into Sarah's tent, the sudden transition from the harsh, exposed wilderness to this warm, fragrant, enclosed space was enough to make their heads spin before they had even taken a single sip of liquor. Madame Sarah understood this psychological terrain better than any doctor or preacher in the territory. She knew that what these men were paying for was not simply physical intimacy, but the rare, exquisite feeling of being treated like a gentleman, if only for an hour or two. In the world outside the tent, they were nothing but numbers on a railroad payroll, or anonymous competitors in a brutal race for survival. But hey, under the soft glow of the lamps, they were welcomed by name. They were met by women who wore clean dresses of gingham and silk, women who smelled of rosewater instead of lye soap, and who listened to their rambling stories about their childhood homes with an air of interested patience that could not be bought anywhere else on the frontier. The women who worked for Sarah were a varied group, each brought to the land rush by her own private currents of necessity and ambition. There was Lou, a tall, quiet woman from Ohio who had lost her family to the cholera outbreak of the previous spring and had found herself stranded in the West with no money and no relatives to take her in. There was Marie, who claimed to be from Paris but spoke with the unmistakable cadence of the New Orleans waterfront, a woman whose sharp wit and skill on the parlor guitar made her the favorite of the railroad engineers and land surveyors. These women were not the helpless victims that the moral reformers in the East imagined them to be. In an environment where a respectable woman could expect to spend her life washing another person's clothes for pennies a day, or working 16 hours in a hot kitchen until her back broke, the life of a sporting woman under a fair madam offered a degree of financial independence that was otherwise completely unobtainable. They earned more in a single evening than a domestic servant could save in a month. And they were provided with food, shelter, and a level of protection that the law itself could not always guarantee. For Madame Sarah, maintaining that protection was her most difficult and most important task. A canvas town during a land rush was a volatile, dangerous organism. There was no established police force, no regular court system, and no jailhouse other than a heavy chain fastened to a large tree stub in the center of the town square. The local sheriff was often a man who had been selected more for his willingness to use a shotgun than for his knowledge of jurisprudence, and his loyalty could shift with the wind. To survive, a madam had to be her own lawgiver and her own enforcer. She did not rely on the pearl-handled revolver she kept tucked into the silk pocket of her petticoats, though she knew how to use it if the occasion required. Her primary weapon was her mind, her ability to read a room, to anticipate trouble before it took off its boots, and to cultivate alliances with the men who held the real power in the community. Every morning, before the rest of the town had fully shaken off the heavy sleep of the frontier night, Sarah would sit at her walnut desk at the back of the tent, reviewing her accounting ledgers with the meticulous precision of a bank clerk. She recorded every bottle of whiskey opened, every cigar sold, and every dollar brought in by the women. But her true ledger was the one she kept in her head. She noted which of the local politicians had borrowed money from her to secure their land titles. She knew which of the railroad directors had spent the night in Marie's quarters, weeping over the loss of his daughter. And she knew exactly which of the deputy marshals was taking a weekly payment to look the other way when the faro games became too lively. This knowledge was her armor. In a world where a woman could be ruined by a single whisper, Sarah's collection of secrets made her practically untouchable. The relationship between the town and the brothel was always a delicate dance of public hypocrisy and private necessity. During the day, the editors of the local frontier newspaper would write fiery editorials about the need to clean up the vices of the canvas city, calling for the removal of the dens of iniquity that stained the moral character of the new territory. The local ministers, preaching from improvised pulpits made of empty beer crates, would warn their congregations against the temptations of the Scarlet Woman. But when the sun dipped below the western horizon, painting the long grass in shades of violet and bruised gold. The very same editors, merchants, and town councilmen could often be seen slipping through the rear entrance of Sarah's tent, their hats pulled low over their eyes as they sought the comfort and conversation that their own respectable lives denied them. Sarah never showed the slightest bitterness toward this double standard. She viewed it with a dry, world-weary humor, understanding that respectability was a luxury that people only felt they could afford once their bellies were full and their roofs were made of shingles instead of canvas. She knew that her business was the oil that kept the gears of the boomtown turning. Without her establishment, the raw, frustrated energy of thousands of unattached men would have torn the fragile community apart in a wave of violence and rioting. She provided a pressure valve for the frontier, a place where men could leave their weapons at the door and submerge their anxieties in the warm, rhythmic hum of the parlor. You can see her dry wit in the way she handled the local tax collectors. When the town site finally incorporated and the new council levied a heavy, discriminatory tax on all places of amusement, intending to squeeze her out of business, Sarah did not argue or threaten to expose their secrets. Instead, she simply closed the house for 3 days during the busiest week of the railroad convention. Within 48 hours, the local saloons were empty, the streets were plagued by brawls between rival track crews, and the town's merchants were complaining about a disastrous drop in retail trade. On the 4th morning, the town council quietly rescinded the tax, and the mayor himself dropped by her desk to present her with a complimentary box of imported chocolates as a token of his esteem. Sarah accepted them with a polite smile, thanked him for his consideration, and immediately went back to her calculations, knowing that she had won a victory that would protect her girls for at least another season. As the initial chaos of the land rush began to settle into something resembling a permanent routine, the appearance of the town began to shift. The canvas tents were slowly replaced by wooden frame buildings, the false fronts rising high into the air to give the illusion of architectural grandeur. The muddy trails were graded into proper streets, and the sound of the piano began to compete with the whistle of the incoming locomotives. Sarah's canvas palace evolved as well, transforming from a great tent into a handsome, 2-story wooden building with a wraparound porch and green shutters that looked out over the rail yards. It was a sign that she was no longer just a transient campfollower. She was a fixture of the New West, an established citizen who paid her bills on time, donated generously to the construction of the local orphanage, and kept a clean house where the peace was never broken. Yet, even as the walls around her grew solid, the memory of that airy, silent ocean of grass never entirely left her. On quiet nights, when the piano keys were silent and the women had retired to their rooms, she would often stand on the upper balcony of her house, looking past the flickering gas lamps of the town out toward the dark, unmapped spaces of the prairie. She could smell the scent of the wild sagebrush carrying on the night wind, a sharp, clean smell that reminded her of the vastness that still lay just beyond the edge of the wooden sidewalks. She knew that the frontier was a temporary thing, a brief, beautiful window where the rules of the old world did not apply and a woman could carve out her own destiny by the sheer force of her will. She had tamed her own piece of that wilderness, not with an axe or a plow, but with an understanding of the human heart, and she intended to hold on to it, no matter how fast the rest of the world caught up with her. The life of a madam in these early days was one of constant vigilance. Every face that entered her establishment was a puzzle to be solved. She had to look at the way a man held his shoulders, the way he reached for his glass, and the way his eyes tracked the movement of the girls around the room. A man who drank too quickly and kept his hand near his belt was a man who was looking for a fight to wash away some hidden shame. A man who sat alone in the corner, nursing a single measure of whiskey for hours, was often a man who had lost his claim or received a letter from back home that had broken his spirit. Sarah trained her girls to recognize these subtle signs, teaching them when to offer a warm laugh and when to simply sit in quiet, companionable silence, letting the man find his bearings in his own time. This intuitive knowledge of human behavior was what set a premier house apart from the cheap dance halls and the dangerous cribs that lined the edges of the red light district. In those lesser places, a man was likely to be robbed, drugged, or drawn into a knife fight over a disputed hand of cards. But in Sarah's house, the guest was safe. His money was secure in her iron safe if he chose to leave it there for the evening, and his reputation was protected by a code of silence that was as absolute as the vows of any monastery. The men knew this, and that security was what brought them back week after week, even when their pockets were light and they could only afford a single beer and a few minutes of conversation. You must also consider the physical reality of managing such an enterprise. It was not all silk dresses and champagne toasts. It was a relentless grind of domestic management. Sarah had to arrange for regular shipments of clean linen from the distant city laundries, a logistical nightmare in a town where the water was often alkaline and ruined fabric within a few washings. She had to supervise the kitchen staff, ensuring that the free lunch counter was stocked with fresh ham, pickled eggs, and rye bread that could tempt a man to stay and drink through the afternoon. She had to handle the internal disputes among her women, balancing their delicate egos, their rivalries over favorite customers, and the occasional bouts of deep, dark depression that were an occupational hazard for women living on the margins of polite society. She did this with a calm, even-handed authority that earned her the nickname the Major among the local business owners. She rarely raised her voice, but when she spoke, her words had the weight of an iron anvil falling on a pine board. She did not tolerate cruelty from the customers or dishonesty from her staff. If a man became abusive or disrespectful to one of her girls, he would find himself looking into the cold, gray eyes of a woman who had seen the worst that the world had to offer and was not intimidated by a loud voice or a silver star. She would have him removed from the premises by her heavyset bartender before he could finish his sentence, and he would find himself blacklisted from every respectable establishment in the county. This protective atmosphere created an intense loyalty among the women who worked for her. They looked up to Sarah not just as an employer, but as a protector and a guide. She was the one who held their hands when they were sick with the winter fevers. She was the one who helped them save their wages so they could eventually buy a piece of land or open a legitimate shop of their own. And she was the one who ensured that if the worst should happen, they would be buried in a proper cemetery with a carved headstone instead of being thrown into an unmarked grave in the potter's field. In a world that treated these women as expendable refuse, Sarah gave them a sense of dignity and a place where they belonged. The dry humor that characterized her conversations with the local elite was often a shield against the deep sadness she witnessed on a daily basis. She saw young men, barely old enough to grow a proper mustache, arrive in the territory with bright eyes and sturdy boots, only to see them broken by the relentless labor of the mines or killed in a senseless dispute over a property line. She saw women who had traveled halfway across the country to join their husbands, only to find themselves widowed and destitute within a few weeks of their arrival, forced to make choices that would have horrified their families back home. She did not judge them. She understood that the frontier was a crucible that melted away all traditional notions of morality, leaving only the raw, basic instinct to survive. Her wit was often her way of pointing out the absurdities of this environment. On one occasion, when the leader of the local temperance society came to her door to demand that she close her bar in the interest of public decency, Sarah did not get angry. She invited the lady into her private parlor, served her a cup of tea that had been heavily laced with fine brandy under the guise of an old family recipe for nerves, and listened to her lecture for over an hour with an air of humble attention. By the time the lady left, her cheeks were flushed, her step was slightly unsteady, and she had accepted a $50 donation from Sarah for the purchase of new hymnals for the church. The next week, the lady's criticisms of Sarah's establishment were notably absent from her public speeches, an outcome that Sarah noted in her ledger under the heading of public relations. As the initial rush of the land grab began to fade into the steady growth of the early 20th century, Sarah looked out over the town she had helped create. The canvas tents were long gone, replaced by brick banks, department stores, and a grand courthouse with a silver dome that caught the morning light. The sound of the wind was now accompanied by the hum of electric wires, the rattle of streetcars, and the occasional honk of a motor carriage. The silent ocean of grass had been cut into neat square sections, fenced with barbed wire, and turned over by the plow until the ancient sword was nothing but a memory. She knew her time in this new, respectable world was drawing to a close. The wild frontier that had given her a chance to build her own life was being replaced by a society that valued conformity above all else. The new laws were more rigid, the new judges less willing to be bought with secrets, and the new residents wanted to forget the raw, chaotic origins of their town. But Sarah did not regret the change. She had played her hand well, she had made her fortune, and she had lived life entirely on her own terms, a feat that very few women of her generation could claim. As she sat on her porch in the quiet hours of the late afternoon, watching the sun sink below the distant hills, she could look back at the dusty tent city with a sense of pride, knowing that when the oceans of grass were silent, she had been one of the few who had known how to speak their language. The shadows grew long across the yard, stretching from the edge of the porch out toward the old road where the wagons used to arrive. The air became cool, carrying that familiar scent of damp earth and coming night. Inside the house, the girls were beginning to wake up, lighting the first lamps of the evening and tuning the piano for the night's guests. The familiar, comfortable routine of her life was about to begin once more. But for a few minutes longer, Sarah stayed outside in the quiet. She watched the first stars appear in the deep blue of the western sky, steady and cold, the same stars that had guided her across the plains when the land was still wild and full of secrets. You can still see that old western spirit if you know where to look. It is there in the weathered wood of the surviving buildings, in the deep ruts of the abandoned trails that can still be seen from the air, and in the quiet cemeteries where the madams, the homesteaders, and the outlaws all lie down together under the same vast, indifferent sky. They were all part of that great, chaotic experiment, each trying to find a way to live in a world that was being born anew with every rising sun. And among them, the Brothel madam stands as a reminder that the history of the West was not just written by the men with the guns and the plows, but by the women who understood that no matter how wild the frontier became, the human heart would always need a place to find a little warmth, a little light, and a moment of quiet before the journey continued. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the cottonwood trees that had been planted along the street to replace the sagebrush. The first notes of the piano drifted out through the open window, a slow, familiar melody that seemed to hang in the evening air like a question. Sarah stood up, smoothed the front of her dark silk dress, and took one last look at the fading horizon. Then, with a slow, deliberate step, she turned and walked inside, leaving the quiet night behind as she closed the door on the silent ocean for another evening. Part 2. The Ledger and the Lumber. If you sit very quietly by the edge of the pine floorboards as the morning sun begins to bake the canvas roof above, you can hear the town trying to figure out what it wants to become. The chaotic scramble of the first few days has begun to harden into a strange, breathless routine, a pattern where every person is trying to outrun their own past or outsmart the neighbor who pitched his tent just 3 feet away. In the early light, before the heat of the day turns the valley into a dusty brick kiln, the air carries a deceptive coolness, a lingering memory of the open prairie that reminds you of how fragile this southern city really is. Madam Sarah sits at her walnut desk, her fingers stained with the dark violet ink she uses to track the movement of human desires and frontier currency, listening to the first shift of railroad laborers tramping down the muddy lane toward the tracks. Their boots make a heavy, sucking sound in the unpaved earth, a rhythmic crunch that serves as the morning alarm for the sporting houses, the saloons, and the land offices that line the primary thoroughfare. She does not look up from her columns when the canvas flaps flutter open to admit the morning air, for she already knows the exact weight of the world that is waiting outside her door. You must understand that in these early weeks, the economy of a boomtown was a fluid, unpredictable creature, resting entirely on the thin margins of hope and speculation. Money arrived in every imaginable form, from shiny eagles minted in Philadelphia to crumpled, grease-stained banknotes issued by private banks in Ohio that might or might not exist by the time the draft was sent east for collection. A man might pay for his evening's entertainment with a handful of rough silver nuggets wrapped in a piece of dainty flannel, or with a gold watch that had his grandfather's initials crudely scratched out of the case with a pocket knife. Sarah accepted them all, her practiced hands weighing the metal, judging the authenticity of the paper, and calculating the exact discount she needed to charge to cover the immense risk of doing business in a territory where the law changed with every new appointment in Washington. In her leather-bound book, every man was reduced to a single line of elegant penmanship, his secrets balanced against his debts, creating a map of the town's hidden power structure that was far more accurate than any document filed at the land office down the street. The women who lived under her roof were also waking to the heat, their quiet murmurs drifting down from the small curtained cubicles that lined the sides of the great tent. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their morning routines shaped by the lack of proper amenities that women in the East took for granted. There were no porcelain basins, no hot water running through copper pipes, and no mirrors larger than a pocket glass hung from a cedar pole. Instead, they shared a single wooden washstand behind the bar, using water that had been hauled from the creek 2 miles away by an enterprising boy who charged 10 cents a bucket. They washed their faces with lye soap that smelled faintly of animal fat, before applying the expensive almond creams and rose water that Sarah imported at ruinous expense from St. Louis. This daily transformation was a form of armor, a ritual where they put away their private griefs, the memories of abandoned farms and broken marriages, and assumed the personas that the frontier demanded of them. Consider the perspective of someone like Lou, who spent her mornings mending the hems of her gingham dresses that had been ruined by the coarse brambles of the street. She had come to the territory on the promise of a schoolteacher's post that had evaporated the moment she stepped off the train, leaving her alone in a town where a single room cost more than a month's wages in her home state. When Sarah found her sitting on her trunk by the side of the depot, her eyes blank with the sudden terror of the unprotected, she did not offer her pity or a sermon on morality. She offered her a clean room, a regular share of the house profits, and a simple piece of advice that Lou would remember for the rest of her days. In this country, Sarah had told her as they watched the dust devil spin across the rail yards, a woman can either be the property of one man who treats her like an ox, or she can sell her time to many men who must treat her like a lady. Choose the latter, and at least you will have your own pocketbook to keep you warm when the winter comes. The afternoons in the Canvas Palace were characterized by a quiet, domestic industry that would have surprised the moralists who viewed these establishments as chaotic dens of continuous revelry. During these long, slow hours, the house was a sanctuary of female companionship, a space where the rules of the outside world were suspended. The girls would gather around the polished walnut bar, their fingers busy with needlework or knitting, while Marie played soft, melancholic melodies on her parlor guitar. They talked not of the men who visited them at night, but of the small things they missed from their childhoods, the taste of fresh cider in the autumn, the smell of damp pine needles in the northern woods, or the sound of rain falling on a shingled roof instead of the constant, hollow rattle of the canvas. Sarah would sometimes join them, bringing her sharp wit and dry humor to the circle, telling stories of her early days in the California camps where a single fresh egg was worth its weight in gold dust and the miners would form a line 3 blocks long just to see a woman's silk bonnet hanging from a clothesline. These stories were more than mere entertainment. They were a form of education for the younger girls, teaching them how to survive in an environment that was fundamentally hostile to their existence. Sarah taught them how to manage the volatile tempers of men who had been drinking too much of the rutgut whiskey sold in the lower dives, explaining that a soft word delivered with an air of absolute authority was far more effective than an open confrontation. She showed them how to recognize the signs of a man who was carrying a hidden weapon or a dangerous secret, and she drilled them on the importance of maintaining an absolute discretion regarding everything they heard within the walls of the house. The men who come here are looking to unburden themselves, she would remind them, her voice low and steady as she turned the pages of her ledger. They will tell you things they would never tell their priests or their wives. They will tell you about the land they stole, the money they hid, and the men they left in the brush. Listen to them, keep their secrets, and you will never find yourself without a friend in the courthouse. The wisdom of this advice became apparent during the third week of the rush, when a prominent land surveyor named Henderson entered the house in a state of advanced intoxication. He was a man of high standing in the community, responsible for drawing the maps that determined the boundaries of the new town lots and the path of the coming railroad extension. He had spent the day arguing with speculators and politicians, and by the time he collapsed into one of Sarah's velvet chairs, his mind was a chaotic tangle of whiskey and anxiety. He began to boast to Marie about his power over the future of the town, pulling a crumpled map from his coat pocket and pointing out the exact location where the new railway depot would be constructed, a site that was currently nothing but an empty quarter section of sagebrush owned by a poor German homesteader. Marie did not interrupt his rambling discourse, nor did she attempt to take the map from his hands. She simply smiled, refilled his glass with Sarah's best bourbon, and listened with an air of rapt, innocent fascination as he explained how a fortune could be made by anyone who bought that land before the railway announcement was made public the following Monday. When Henderson finally drifted off into a heavy, snoring sleep, Marie did not whisper the secret to the other girls, nor did she seek out a speculator in the street. She walked straight to the back of the tent and told Madame Sarah, who sat in the shadows of her desk, her face illuminated by a single candle. Sarah did not hesitate. She did not seek to buy the land herself, for she knew that a madam who suddenly became a major property owner would attract the kind of scrutiny and resentment that could destroy her business. Instead, she sent a quiet message to the local marshal, a man named Miller who had been helpful to her in the past and whose weekly retainer was always paid in clean gold coin. By dawn, Miller had purchased the land from the unsuspecting homesteader for a fraction of its true value, sharing a significant portion of the future profits with Sarah through a dummy corporation registered in a neighboring state. When the railroad announcement was made the following week, Miller became a wealthy man. The German homesteader moved back to Illinois with a modest profit, and Madame Sarah secured an ally in the marshal's office whose loyalty was now cemented by a shared fortune. Henderson, when he woke the next morning with a splitting headache and an empty pocketbook, never realized that his drunken boast had rewritten the financial geography of the county. This incident illustrated the subtle, invisible web of influence that a successful madam wove around her establishment. To the casual observer, she was merely a purveyor of illicit pleasures, a figure to be tolerated or condemned depending on the time of day. But to those who understood the mechanics of the frontier, she was a central hub in the machinery of development, a person who knew the true value of every asset and every individual in the territory. Her house was a neutral ground where enemies could meet without their bodyguards, where bargains could be struck without the intervention of lawyers, and where the raw, violent energy of the land rush could be converted into the stable, predictable patterns of commerce. As the month drew to a close, the physical landscape of the town began to undergo a profound transformation. The great city of tents was slowly dying, its place taken by a frantic forest of wooden skeletons as the sounds of the carpenter's hammer replaced the flap of canvas in the wind. The smell of green pine lumber was everywhere, a sharp, clean scent that signified the transition from a temporary camp to a permanent settlement. Sarah watched this change with a mixture of calculation and a strange, world-weary nostalgia. She knew that the era of the canvas palace was ending, and that if she wished to maintain her position, she would have to build a structure that could match the ambitions of the new town leaders. She contracted with a master builder from Chicago who had come west to escape his creditors, paying him in advance with the gold she had earned from the railroad cruise. She purchased a double lot on the corner of the new main avenue, far enough from the tracks to escape the soot of the locomotives, but close enough for the travelers to find their way without a guide. The building she envisioned was not a mere saloon with rooms upstairs, but a grand, two-story mansion with a wide veranda, green shutters, and a central hallway that would allow the air to circulate during the stifling summer months. She ordered real glass windows from Pittsburgh, marble fireplaces from Vermont, and wallpaper from New York that featured intricate patterns of gold leaf and crimson silk. The construction of this house became a matter of intense curiosity for the townsfolk. Every afternoon, a small crowd of homesteaders, merchants, and idle onlookers would gather along the wooden sidewalk to watch the frame rise against the blue western sky. The local newspaper, which had previously called for the expulsion of all sporting women from the district, now published regular updates on the progress of the building, praising the enterprise and public spirit of our esteemed citizen, Madame Sarah, whose new residence will add greatly to the architectural beauty of our thriving metropolis. Sarah read these accounts with a characteristic dry humor, noting that the editor's tone had softened remarkably after she had taken over the mortgage on his printing press. The girls were eager to leave the great tent, which had become increasingly uncomfortable as the summer heat intensified. The canvas trapped the dust from the street, turning the air into a thick, gritty soup that ruined their dresses and made sleep almost impossible during the day. They would walk down to the construction site in the evenings after the workmen had gone home, their silk slippers stepping carefully over the piles of cedar shavings and discarded nails as they explored the skeletal frames of their future rooms. Marie would stand in the space that would become the main parlor, testing the acoustics of the unfinished walls with a few chords on her guitar, while Lou looked out the window openings at the growing town, wondering if this new wooden fortress would finally be enough to keep the wilderness at bay. Yet, even as the walls rose and the promise of luxury drew closer, the danger of the frontier remained a constant presence. One evening, as the twilight was fading into a deep, starless night, a group of Texas cattlemen rode into the town, their spirits inflamed by a week of hard driving and an afternoon spent in the low gambling dens near the rail yards. They were men of a different breed than the railroad labourers or the homesteaders. They were wild, reckless, and profoundly resentful of the changes that were turning the open range into a grid of fences and town lots. They rode down the main avenue, firing their pistols into the air and shouting defiance at the new town regulations that forbade the carrying of weapons within the settlement limits. When they reached Sarah's canvas palace, they did not stop. They pushed their horses right up to the entrance, their heavy spades jingling against the stirrups as they demanded admittance. The leader of the group, a scarred man named Vance who carried a long Bowie knife in his belt, shouted for the madam to bring out her finest liquor and her prettiest girls, threatening to burn the tent to the ground if they were kept waiting in the dust. Inside, the music stopped instantly. The customers, mostly quiet merchants and railroad clerks, shrank back into the shadows behind the bar, their faces pale with the sudden realization that there was no law within 3 miles that could protect them from these men. Madame Sarah did not hide behind the walnut counter, nor did she send one of the girls to look for the marshal. She walked out onto the wooden platform at the front of the tent, her dark silk dress rustling against the pine planks, her face as calm and expressionless as a stone carving. She looked up at Vance, her gray eyes reflecting the amber light of the kerosene lamps that hung from the entrance poles. She did not speak immediately, letting the silence grow until the only sound was the heavy breathing of the horses and the distant clatter of a switch engine in the rail yards. "You are a long way from the Brazos, Mr. Vance," she said at last, her voice carrying a soft, world-weary cadence that seemed to take the edge off the tension. "And you are riding horses that look as though they have not had a proper feed since they crossed the Red River. If you wish to ruin your stock by galloping through the mud, that is your affair. But if you wish to drink in my house, you will leave your iron in your saddlebags and your horses at the livery stable down the street. My girls do not entertain men who smell of horse sweat and bad manners." Vance stared down at her, his hand resting on the pommel of his saddle, his face twisting into a dangerous smile. He was used to women who screamed or begged when he showed his temper, and this quiet, dignified opposition confused him. He looked past her into the warm, elegant interior of the tent, seeing the polished glass bottles, the velvet chairs, and the quiet comfort that he had not experienced in 4 months of trail driving. The contrast between the cold, muddy street and the luxury inside was a powerful argument, and Sarah's cool indifference made him feel suddenly small and foolish in his dirt-stained buckskins. He let out a short, barking laugh before drawing his pistol from its holster. For a terrible second, the crowd inside held its breath, expecting the flash of black powder. But Vance merely turned the weapon in his hand, holding it by the barrel as he extended it toward Sarah. "You have a sharp tongue for an old woman, madam," he muttered, his voice dropping into a gruff, reluctant show of respect. "But I reckon you know how to treat a thirsty man. Take the iron, and tell that bartender of yours to start pouring the good stuff." Sarah accepted the heavy revolver, its metal still warm from the heat of his hand, and stepped aside to let him pass. The other cowboys followed his lead, dismounting and handing their weapons to Sarah with an air of sheepish obedience that would have astonished their employers back in Texas. Within an hour, they were sitting peacefully at the Walnut Bar, their wild energy successfully channeled into the consumption of expensive whiskey and the purchase of Marie songs. Sarah sat at her desk, her fingers once again busy with her ledger, recording the evening's unexpected profits with the same quiet precision she applied to every transaction. She had averted a riot not with violence, but with an absolute refusal to be intimidated, a demonstration of character that did more to establish her authority in the town than a dozen new ordinances passed by the city council. When the night finally began to break, the sky turning the color of an old slate stone before the first flush of dawn, the cowboys staggered out of the tent, their pockets empty but their tempers entirely cooled. Sarah walked to the front platform to watch them go, her eyes tracking their uneven steps as they disappeared into the gray mist that rose from the prairie. The town was quiet once more, the hammers of the carpenters silent for a few hours longer, the wind blowing soft through the skeletal ribs of the new buildings. She could feel the future approaching with every tick of the brass clock on her desk, a future made of brick, law, and respectability that would eventually have no place for women like her. But until that day arrived, she would continue to hold the line between the wilderness and the town, writing her own history in the margins of the ledger, one night at a time. Part 3. The House of Solid Wood. If you walk down the newly graded avenue in the late summer twilight, when the heat of the day still radiates from the packed dirt like the breath of a dying furnace, you can see the exact moment where the temporary frontier gives way to the permanent town. The old canvas palace, which had stood for months as a beacon of warmth against the open prairie, has finally been taken down, its heavy cedar poles stacked behind the livery stable and its stained canvas roof sold to a freighting company to cover wagons bound for the deeper territories. In its place, on the prime corner lot near the rising brick foundations of the new courthouse, stands the House of Solid Wood. It is a grand, two-story structure of northern pine and cedar, its fresh paint gleaming white under the rising moon, its wraparound veranda casting deep, cool shadows across the newly laid wooden sidewalks. When you step onto the porch, leaving the dust of the road behind, the ground beneath your feet no longer gives or shifts as the dirt floor of the tent did. It is solid, unyielding, and quiet, a testament to the fact that Madame Sarah has dug her roots deep into this earth, transforming her enterprise from a transient camp follower into an immovable pillar of the frontier economy. You can smell the change before you even cross the threshold. The raw, pungent odors of the early boomtown, the mule sweat, the greenwood smoke, and the sour vinegar of cheap saloons have been pushed back to the margins of the rail yards. Hey, the air carries the rich, clean scent of fresh linseed oil, polished beeswax, and the damp, cool fragrance of imported plaster that has only recently dried within the thick walls. Inside the main parlor, the light no longer flickers with every passing breeze that stays the canvas. It is steady and warm, cast by two large crystal chandeliers shipped in wooden crates from St. Louis, their glass prisms rattling with a faint, musical chime whenever a heavy freight train rumbles past the depot 3 blocks away. The walls are covered in deep crimson wallpaper with intricate patterns of gold leaf that seem to absorb the lamplight, creating a soft, velvet atmosphere that makes the outside world of sagebrush and barbed wire feel like a distant, forgotten memory. For the women who live and work here, the transition from the tent to the house has been a revelation of small, exquisite comforts that have altered the very rhythm of their days. Each girl now possesses her own room on the second floor, a private sanctuary with a solid oak door that can be closed and locked from the inside, a luxury that was entirely unimaginable during the crowded days of the canvas city. If you were to look into Marie's room in the quiet hours of the afternoon, you would see a real brass bedstead with a mattress filled with clean goose feathers instead of the lye-washed straw ticks of the camp. You would see a porcelain wash basin painted with delicate blue cornflowers, a small rocking chair near the window, and a walnut wardrobe where her silk and gingham dresses hang without the constant threat of being ruined by the wind-driven dust of the plains. These rooms are more than mere places of business. They are small kingdoms of personal identity, where a woman can keep her old family photographs, her private journals, and her savings without fear of theft or exposure. Madame Sarah's private office sits at the very end of the second-floor hallway, positioned so that she can look down from her window at the front entrance and the street below. Her walnut desk, which had once looked so out of place against the dirt floor of the tent, now sits perfectly anchored on a thick wool rug imported from Ohio. The iron safe that contains her ledgers, her gold coin, and the deeds to her growing property investments is no longer hidden beneath a canvas top. It is bolted directly to the heavy pine floor joists behind a chair. As she sits in the quiet afternoon, her fingers moving rhythmically over her accounting columns, she can hear the faint, comforting sounds of her house at rest. The distant murmur of the girls talking in the parlor, the steady scritch-scratch of a broom on the porch, and the deep, resonant ticking of the grandfather clock that stands in the central hallway. The grand opening of the wooden house was an event that the town would talk about for years, a night when the delicate balance of frontier society was displayed in all its complex, hypocritical glory. Sarah did not issue public invitations, nor did she advertise the evening in the local newspaper, for she knew that the promise of exclusivity was far more powerful than any printed notice. She simply instructed her bartender to polish the glassware, told Marie to tune the parlor piano, and let it be known among the prominent men of the territory that her doors would be open at 8 o'clock. Long before the appointed hour, the wooden sidewalk outside was crowded with men who had put on their finest clothes for the occasion. There were lawyers in long black coats, land speculators with diamond pins stuck into their silk cravats, wealthy cattle barons who had ridden 50 miles from their ranches, and the very same town councilmen who had spent the previous week debating the moral boundaries of the new municipal charter. When you entered the parlor that night, the transition from the rough frontier to Sarah's version of civilization was absolute. The long bar counter, made of dark, polished mahogany that had been hauled by a team of 12 oxen from the riverport, was lined with crystal decanters filled with genuine imported liquors. There was no rotgut or blue ruin to be found here. Sarah served only the finest Kentucky bourbons, Scotch whiskies, and dry French wines that cost more for a single glass than a railroad laborer earned in a week. The girls stood at the top of the grand staircase, descending one by one into the crowded room like ladies at a gubernatorial ball. They wore dresses of silk, satin, and velvet that Sarah had ordered from Chicago, their hair styled in the latest Eastern fashions, their skins smelling of expensive almond flour water and fine rice powder. The atmosphere was one of restrained, elegant revelry, a performance of respectability that both the guests and the hosts were determined to maintain. The men spoke in lowered voices, their rough frontier language carefully checked at the door, their conversations turning on the future of the territory, the price of railroad stock, and the upcoming elections for the county seat. Marie sat at the grand piano, her fingers flying over the ivory keys as she played classical waltzes and sentimental ballads that brought tears to the eyes of men who had not seen their homes in a decade. Sarah moved through the crowd with the grace of a seasoned diplomat, her sharp wit and dry humor diffusing any potential rivalries between competing politicians or speculators before they could disrupt the harmony of the evening. She knew exactly which judge to compliment on his recent decision, which merchant to ask about his latest shipment of dry goods, and which young clerk to remind gently of his tab, managing the room with an authority that was as absolute as it was invisible. Yet, even as the house celebrated its success, the changing dynamics of the land rush were beginning to introduce a new, more insidious kind of conflict to the frontier. The initial wave of unattached men and transient laborers was slowly being superseded by the arrival of the respectable families, the wives, daughters, and sisters of the merchants and professionals who came to build churches, establish schools, and impose the rigid social hierarchies of the East upon the raw clay of the West. These women did not look upon Madame Sarah or her girls with the pragmatic tolerance of the early pioneers. They viewed them as a moral pestilence, a stain upon the reputation of their new community that had to be eradicated if the town was ever to achieve true respectability. This led to a quiet, unspoken Cold War that played out daily on the wooden sidewalks of the main avenue. When Sarah or Lou walked down the street in the afternoon to visit the dry goods store or the bank, the respectable women would gather their skates tightly about their ankles, turning their faces toward the shop windows to avoid making eye contact. They would whisper behind their gloved hands, their eyes tracking the spotting women with a mixture of intense condemnation and secret curiosity. The local ministers, urged on by their female parishioners, began to deliver fiery sermons from their new brick pulpits, calling for the creation of a restricted district, or the outright expulsion of the scarlet elements that corrupted the youth of the town. Sarah viewed these developments with her characteristic world-weary detachment, refusing to be drawn into an open confrontation that she knew she could not win through force alone. She understood that respectability was a performance, a shield that society used to hide its own anxieties and contradictions. She did not try to argue with the ministers or defend her character to the ladies' aid societies. Instead, she used her financial power to secure her position, making substantial, anonymous donations to the very building funds of the churches that preached against her, and ensuring that her accounts at the local bank were large enough to make the directors think twice before supporting any legislation that might harm her business. She knew that gold was a universal language, spoken as fluently by the righteous as it was by the fallen, and she used it to build a wall of protection around her house that no sermon could easily breach. An incident that occurred during the late autumn illustrated the effectiveness of his strategy and the deep hypocrisy that ran through the heart of the developing community. The town was preparing for its first official municipal election, a contest that pitted the old pioneer faction, led by Marshall Miller and the early speculators, against the new law and order party, backed by the wealthy merchants and the church groups. The candidate for the Reform Party was a prominent hardware merchant named Albright, a man who built his campaign entirely on the promise of cleaning up the Vice District, vowing to shut down Sarah's house and drive every sporting woman out of the county within 30 days of taking office. Albright was a fiery speaker, his rallies attended by large crowds of enthusiastic citizens who cheered his declarations of moral renewal. He seemed assured of victory, his campaign gaining momentum with every denunciation of the dens of iniquity that lined the avenues. But Albright possessed a private ledger that was far less respectable than his public speeches, a record of debts and personal indiscretions that had been quietly accumulating in Madame Sarah's safe for over a year. He had borrowed heavily from her through a third party to finance his business expansions, and he had spent many an evening in her private parlor, seeking relief from the cold, demanding respectability of his own home and the warm company of a young woman named Jenny. Sarah did not release this information to the public, nor did she threaten Albright directly, for she knew that an open scandal could backfire, turning him into a martyr for the reform cause. Instead, she waited until the week before the election, choosing an afternoon when the hardware store was crowded with customers. She sent Lou down the avenue, carrying a small, sealed envelope addressed to Mr. Albright personally. Inside the envelope was not a threat, but a simple, beautifully written statement of his outstanding account, including the dates of his visits to the house and the signatures of the witnesses who had verified his financial loans. Attached to the statement was a short, polite note from Sarah, wishing him success in his campaign and expressing her confidence that, as a man of business, he would want to settle his private obligations before assuming the heavy duties of public office. The effect of the note was immediate and profound. The next evening, at what was supposed to be his grand pre-election rally, Albright's rhetoric underwent a sudden, remarkable transformation. He spoke no more of driving the sporting women from the territory. Instead, he talked of the need for moderation, stability, and the careful regulation of our local commerce, suggesting that the town's existing businesses, if properly managed and taxed, could provide the revenue needed to pave the streets and build the new schoolhouse. His supporters were confused by this shift in tone, their enthusiasm cooling as his speeches grew dull and administrative. When the ballots were counted the following Tuesday, Marshall Miller's faction won a narrow victory. Albright returned to his hardware business with his reputation intact, and Madame Sarah's house remained undisturbed, her position stronger than ever before. As the winter approached, the physical reality of the frontier once again asserted itself, testing the strength of the new wooden structures against the raw power of the plains. The long, golden days of autumn vanished overnight, replaced by the howling northern winds that brought the first heavy snowstorms down from the mountains. The prairie, which had been a sea of green and then a desert of dust, was now a vast, blinding ocean of white, a landscape of absolute desolation where the horizon disappeared into the gray sky. The temperature plummeted until the ink froze in Sarah's inkwell and the heavy timbers of the house groaned and popped in the night like pistol shots as the frost dug deep into the wood. During these long, freezing months, the House of Solidwood became more than a place of business. It became a literal fortress of survival against the winter. The great stone fireplaces in the parlor and the dining room were kept burning 24 hours a day, consumed cords of oak and hickory that Sarah had purchased from the timber crews along the river. The air inside was warm and thick with the smell of roasting meats, baking bread, and the sweet, resinous scent of the pine wood heating in the hearths. The men of the town, cut off from their work by the frozen ground and the drifted roads, would gather in the parlor early in the afternoon, seeking the warmth and human companionship that their own cold, draughty shanties could not provide. You can imagine the scene on a bitter January night, with the blizzard rattling the window panes and the snow piling high against the veranda railings. Inside, the chandeliers are dimmed to a warm, amber glow, their light reflecting off the frosted glass of the windows. The room is filled with the low, murmuring hum of men at ease, their heavy winter coats hanging from the brass pegs in the hall, their feet resting comfortably on the velvet footstools near the fire. Marie sits at the piano, her music competing with the howl of the wind outside, playing slow, familiar melodies that seem to weave a spell of safety around the room. Lou sits on the sofa, her fingers busy with a piece of embroidery, while a wealthy cattleman explains his plans for the spring roundup, his voice dropping into a quiet, respectful cadence that matches the peaceful rhythm of the house. In these moments, the madam's dry wit and sharp understanding of human nature were directed toward maintaining the morale of her household. The winter isolation could be a terrible thing for women living on the frontier, often bringing on a deep, suffocating melancholy that the locals called the prairie madness. Cut off from the outside world, with nothing to look at but the white waste of snow and nothing to do but wait for the spring, the girls would sometimes fall into silent, weeping depressions, their minds turned backward toward the families they had lost or the lives they had abandoned. Sarah watched for the first signs of this winter sickness with the vigilance of a ship's captain. She did not allow the girls to stay in their rooms during the day, forcing them to come down to the parlor, to participate in the domestic work of the house, and to join in the evening games of whist and faro that she organized around the dining table. She would use her dry humor to tease them out of their dark moods, telling ridiculous stories of her own youth or pointing out the absurdities of the local town leaders, making them laugh until the heavy weight of the winter seemed to lift from their shoulders. She ensured that the kitchen was stocked with dried fruits, white flour, and fine tea, understanding that a good meal and a warm cup of sugar could do more to cure a heavy heart than any medical draught. The ledger during these months recorded a different kind of profit. It was not a time of grand financial gains, for the town's economy was frozen along with the ground, and many of the customers were running tabs that would not be settled until the cattle sales or the railroad paymasters arrived in the spring. Sarah carried them all, her ledger columns filling with the names of men who owed her for their winter board, their drinks, and their entertainment. She did not press them for payment, for she knew that the frontier was a game of patience, and that the loyalty she cultivated during the hard winter months would return to her tenfold when the sun turned the prairie green once more. When the first thaws finally arrived in late March, the snow melting into furious torrents of mud that turned the avenues into impassable rivers, the house of solid wood had survived its first great test. Its timbers were seasoned, its plaster intact, and its reputation as the premier establishment in the territory was securely established. Madame Sarah stood on her upper balcony, watching the first freight wagons of the spring struggle through the mire, her gray eyes clear and steady as she looked out over the changing town. The canvas city was a thing of the past, a memory buried beneath the wooden sidewalks and the brick foundations of the new order. The wilderness was being tamed, section by section, law by law, but within the walls of her house, Sarah had created a space that belonged entirely to her, a kingdom of silk, wood, and secrets that would stand as long as the frontier itself. Part 4. Spring thaw and the drifting shadows. If you stand by the open window of the upper hallway during the soft, damp weeks of early April, you can feel the entire frontier stretching itself after the long winter sleep. The great white silence that had locked the territory in ice for 4 months is dissolving into an absolute chaos of mud, water, and sudden, frantic movement. The prairie earth, soaked through by the melting snows, has turned into a deep, black mire that the locals call bottomless. A thick, sticky soup that swallows wagon axles whole and turns a simple walk across the avenue into an exhausting battle against the soil itself. But the mud does not stop the human tide. It merely slows it down, turning the arrival of the spring trains into a daily spectacle of muddy desperation. The locomotives, their black iron bellies covered in rust and soot from the mountain passes, steam into the depot twice a day now, each time disgorging a fresh wave of humanity into the raw clay of the town. They come with the same wide, anxious eyes that Sarah had seen in the first days of the rush, but there is a different quality to this new crowd. The desperate, lone adventurers of the previous year are now accompanied by small-town merchants with families, eastern speculators with crisp paper drafts, and young women looking for work in the grand brick hotels that are beginning to rise along the rail yards. You can smell the seasonal shift in the very fabric of the house. The heavy, greasy scent of the winter fires, the oak smoke and the tallow candles, is being replaced by the sharp, clean perfume of lemon oil, vinegar wash, and the damp breeze carrying the smell of the awakening grasslands. Sarah has ordered all the heavy wool carpets taken out to the yard, where the houseboys beat them with wicker paddles until the air is thick with the gray dust of the winter logs. The windows, long sealed with rags and tallow to keep out the killing frost, are thrown wide to the morning sun, allowing the parlor curtains to flutter like white flags against the crimson wallpaper. In the parlor below, the grand piano has been pulled away from a stone fireplace and placed near the veranda doors, its polished mahogany casework catching the bright, watery light of the spring noon. The girls have put away their heavy flannel wrappers, appearing now in light gingham and printed lawn dresses that rustle softly as they move through the clean rooms, their spirits visibly lifting as the sun regains its power over the western horizon. Madame Sarah watches this annual revival from the quiet vantage of her desk, her gray eyes noting every change in the ledger of the town. She sees that the price of lumber has doubled since the thaw, driven by the furious demand for new storefronts and residential cottages. She notes that the local bank has raised its interest rates on land loans, a sign that the early, wild speculation is hardening into a more rigid, corporate form of finance. Her own business is thriving, the winter debts being settled one by one as the cattlemen receive their drafts from the Chicago stockyards and the railroad crews return to the tracks. But she does not allow the easy money of the spring to make her careless. She knows that a boomtown is an unstable creature, and that the same progress that brings brick buildings and electric wires will eventually bring an end to the profitable lawlessness that allowed her to build her empire. Her drywood is often her only defense against the increasing pomposity of the new town elite. One morning, the new president of the local board of trade, a wealthy land developer named Vance who had recently arrived from Philadelphia, dropped by her office under the pretense of discussing a property boundary. He spent 20 minutes boasting about his plans to turn the avenue into a Paris of the plains, with grand stone arcades, a formal opera house, and a municipal police force that would cleanse the community of its primitive elements. Sarah listened to his grand discourse with an air of polite, sleepy attention, her fingers idly turning a silver dollar on the desktop. When he finally paused for breath, she looked up, her lips curving into a dry, world-weary smile. "It is a beautiful vision, Mr. Vance," she murmured, her voice carrying that soft, reassuring cadence that always made men feel slightly uncertain. "But before you build your opera house, you might want to see about paving the avenue. Only yesterday, I watched the mayor's carriage sink so deep into the mud that they had to use a team of 4 oxen to haul his honor out of the ruts. It is difficult for a community to appreciate the finer arts when they are busy pulling their boots out of the earth." Vance's face turned a sharp, brilliant red, and his departure was notably more abrupt than his arrival, a small victory that Sarah recorded with a quiet chuckle in the margin of her memory. The spring also brings new characters to the house, each adding their own line to the complex human geography of the establishment. Among them is a young woman named Clara, who arrived on the first through train from Boston. She had been recruited by an agency that promised respectable employment as a dining room girl in the new railroad hotels, but upon her arrival, she found that the hotel was nothing but a frame shack with a dirt floor, and the employer was a brutal, red-faced man who expected his staff to live in a crowded loft above the kitchen. Terrified by the raw violence of the camp and completely destitute, she had fled into the street, her small canvas bag clutched to her chest, until a sympathetic drayman directed her to the White House on the corner. When you look at Clara sitting in Sarah's private parlor, you can see the profound vulnerability that the frontier inflicts upon the unprepared. She was small, with pale skin that had never known the western sun, her eyes red from weeping, her voice trembling as she begged Sarah for any honest work, even if it was only scrubbing the kitchen floors or washing the sheets. Sarah did not question her about her past, nor did she try to persuade her to join the sporting side of the house. She simply gave her a hot bowl of mutton broth, a clean apron, and assigned her to help the cook in the kitchen, understanding that Clara needed time to find her footing in this dangerous new world. "There are many ways for a woman to make her living in this country, child," Sarah told her as she cleared the tea things. and not all of them require a silk dress. You stay here, keep your eyes open, and you will find your own path soon enough. This maternal protectiveness was balanced by a keen eye for the cultural shifts that were transforming the social life of the community. The arrival of the railroad had brought more than just settlers. It had brought the first traveling entertainments. The itinerant theater companies, the minstrel shows, and the wandering portrait photographers who carried their heavy glass plates and chemical baths in covered wagons across the territories. One afternoon, a photographer named Professor Higgins set up his tripod in the vacant lot across from the house, his arrival announced by a large handbill pasted to the livery stable door that offered to capture the true image of the frontier for posterity and the folks back east. The photographer was a thin, nervous man with fingers permanently stained black by silver nitrate, and he spent days capturing the likenesses of the town's prominent citizens. The merchants standing proudly before their false front stores, the marshals with their hands resting on their gun belts, and the homestead families posed stiffly in front of their sod houses. But Higgins was not satisfied with these respectably dull portraits. He wanted to capture the romance and the wild character of the territory, and he knew that no record of the West would be complete without a view of Madame Sarah's famous establishment. He approached the house with a great deal of hesitation, expecting to be driven off by the heavy bartender or insulted by the madam herself. Instead, he found Sarah sitting on the veranda, enjoying the cool afternoon air with a book in her lap. When he made his request, his voice cracking with anxiety as he explained his desire to include her parlor in his historical collection, Sarah did not refuse. She looked at his worn boots, his threadbare coat, and his desperate, artistic ambition, and she saw a man who was trying to catch a shadow before the sun moved. She agreed to the sitting, but on her own terms. She did not allow him to photograph the girls in the evening finery, nor would she permit any images that could be used to compromise the reputations of her guests. Instead, she organized a grand, formal portrait of the entire household on the front veranda. She instructed the women to wear their most conservative high-neck day dresses. Marie brought out her classical guitar, and Sarah herself sat in center of the group, dressed in her finest black silk, her silver hair arranged in an elegant crown. You must imagine the scene as the townspeople gathered along the wooden sidewalk to watch the performance. The photographer, hidden beneath his heavy black cloth, his hands trembling as he adjusted the brass lens focus, while the women of the house stood as still as marble statues against the white pine railings. The light was perfect, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden lines across the veranda boards, illuminating the intricate details of the lace collars and the polished mahogany of the front door. When the magnesium flash powder exploded with a sudden, brilliant white glare and a cloud of pungent gray smoke, the crowd let out a collective gasp, as if they had witnessed a piece of magic. The resulting photograph, which Sarah purchased from Higgins for a generous sum of silver, was a masterpiece of ironical respectability. To anyone back east who saw it, it looked like a portrait of a wealthy seminary for young ladies or a gathering of a prominent pioneer family. There was no hint of the secrets that were kept within the walls, no sign of the ledgers or the gold coin, only an image of calm, dignified elegance that challenged every stereotype of the Frente bordello. Sarah hung the framed print in the central hallway, right beneath the grandfather clock, where every judge, politician, and merchant who entered the house could look upon it and see their own hypocrisy reflected back at them in beautiful, silver-toned realism. The dry humor that Sarah brought to this incident was a necessity, for the reality of the frontier was becoming increasingly litigious and complicated. The spring brought the arrival of the circuit court judge, a Stein, legalistic man named Davis who traveled from county to county to try the backlogs of land disputes, horse thefts, and homicides that had accumulated during the winter. Davis was a man who believed that the written law was the only thing that separated the continent from absolute savagery, and he carried his law books with him in a leather trunk like a priest carrying the Holy Scriptures. Unlike the local marshal, Judge Davis could not be bought with gold coin or influenced by whispers in the parlor. He was determined to enforce the strict statutes against gambling and vice that had been passed by the state legislature, and his arrival struck terror into the hearts of the local saloon owners and faro dealers. They closed their backrooms, hid their dice, and prepared for a week of legal persecution. Sarah, however, did not close her doors or alter her routine. She knew that while Judge Davis was immune to bribery, he was profoundly dependent on the physical comforts of civilization. The circuit court was held in an unfinished wooden warehouse that was drafty, cold, and smelled of wet hides. The judge, a man of advanced years who suffered from a chronic affliction of the lungs, spent his days listening to the endless, shouting arguments of frantic lawyers, his body aching from the hard benches and the damp air. When the court adjourned for the evening, Davis did not return to the crowded, noisy rooms of the local hotel, where 4 men slept to a single bed and the blankets were alive with vermin. He walked straight to the White House on the corner, where Madame Sarah had reserved her finest second-floor room for his exclusive use. In that room, the judge found a clean bed with goose-feather pillows, a blazing fire in the small hearth, and a table set with fresh linen and a hot pot of beef stew prepared by Clara. Every evening, after he had eaten his supper and washed the dust of the courtroom from his throat, Davis would come down to Sarah's private office. They would sit by the window, watching the stars rise over the rail yards, sharing a quiet pot of tea that Sarah had flavored with a few drops of old Jamaican rum. They did not talk of the cases before the court, nor did they discuss the legality of her business. They spoke of the books they had read, the cities they had left behind, and the strange, irresistible beauty of the prairie night. "You are an anomaly in this country, Sarah," the judge said to her one evening, his voice raspy from the day's trials. "You operate a business that my books tell me is a threat to the public order. Yet your house is the only place in this entire territory where man can find an hour of peace, a clean sheet, and a conversation that does not turn on the price of beef or the theft of a quarter section. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" Sarah looked out at the dark silhouette of the courthouse dome, her face calm in the candlelight. "I do not reconcile it, Judge," she replied with her characteristic dry wit. "I leave the reconciliation to you and your books. My business is not with the law, but with the men who make it. And as long as your courts are cold and your hotels are dainty, I suspect I will always have a place in your jurisdiction." Davis let out a rare dry laugh before turning back to his tea, acknowledging a truth that no legislative act could easily alter. When the circuit court left the town the following week, Sarah's house remained untouched, the grand jury having mysteriously failed to find any evidence of misconduct within her establishment, an outcome that surprised no one who understood the comforting power of her hospitality. As the spring weeks advanced into the dry, windy days of May, the mud began to harden into a gray, concrete crust, and the town took another great step toward modernity. The first telegraph lines were strung along the railroad track, their glass insulators gleaming like green beads on the cedar poles, connecting the boomtown to the instantaneous murmurs of the wider world. You could stand on the veranda in the evening and hear the faint, high hum of the wires in the wind, a strange, metallic vibration that seemed to sound the death knell of the old isolation. Sarah watched the installation of the wires with a quiet, contemplative air. She understood that the telegraph was the true vanguard of civilization, far more powerful than the marshals or the ministers. With the wires came the big eastern markets, the corporate managers who could direct the fate of the town from an office in New York, and the rapid, nervous rhythm of modern life that left no room for the slow, personal arrangements of the old frontier. The oceans of grass were no longer silent. They were filled with the invisible click-click of copper messages, recording the profits and losses of a continent that was being swallowed by the machine. Yet, inside the house of solid wood, the old rhythm still held sway for a little longer. The girls still gathered in the parlor in the afternoon, their laughter floating out through the open doors into the fragrant spring air. Marie had learned a new song from one of the theater musicians, a sweet, haunting melody about a sailor who never returned from the sea, and her voice would drift down the avenue, stopping the muddy teamsters in their tracks as they listened to the sudden, unexpected beauty of her music. Clara had become an indispensable part of the household, her pale cheeks regaining their color under the western sun. She had found her path not in the parlor, but in the kitchen and the garden that Sarah had laid out behind the house. She spent her mornings planting rows of cabbages, onions, and sweet peas in the rich prairie soil, tending the young shoots with a quiet, rhythmic devotion that seemed to ground her in the new land. Sarah would often stand on the back porch, watching the young girl work with her hands in the dark earth, seeing a symbol of the future that would eventually replace them all. When the night came, the house would assume its familiar, glittering persona. The crystal chandeliers would cast their warm, amber glow over the velvet curtains, the mahogany bar would fill with the leaders of the new territory, and the sound of the piano would drown out the hum of the telegraph wires outside. Sarah sat at her desk, her ink pen moving steadily across the pages of her ledger, recording the spring profits with the calm, unwavering hand of a woman who knew exactly what her world was worth. She had survived the canvas city. She had outlasted the winter frost, and she had tamed the law with her hospitality. She was the madam of the frontier, a queen of the margins who had carved an empire out of the dust, and she would hold her ground as long as the grass grew and the trains came west. The wind shifted, blowing from the deep interior of the plains, bringing the clean, wild smell of the sagebrush into the crowded room. Sarah paused in her writing, looking out at the stars that were being slowly obscured by the smoke of the railroad yards. The future was coming, fast and loud, but tonight, the house was warm, the music was sweet, and the ledger was perfectly balanced. Part 5. The Midsummer Dust and the Sparks of Change. If you were to step outside onto the wraparound veranda during the heavy, breathless hours of a midsummer afternoon, the heat would strike your chest like a physical blow. A dry, shimmering weight that rises from the baked clay of the avenue and turns the distant horizon into a dancing, unstable illusion of water. The green ocean of the spring prairie has burned away, replaced by a vast, golden desert of cued bunchgrass and brittle sagebrush that crackles like parchment under the slightest breeze. The mud that had defined the spring thaw has dried into a fine, gray powder, a suffocating dust that rises in great clouds behind every passing wagon, coating the white paint of the house in a dull, gritty film, and finding its way through the tightest window seals to settle upon the red velvet carpets. The town has grown louder, more crowded, and infinitely more irritable under the relentless glare of the July sun. The constant clatter of the hammers has slowed down during the peak hours of the day, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of pile drivers down by the river where the new iron bridge is being anchored, and the dry, metallic shriek of steam shovels clearing the grade for the factory district. The frontier is no longer just expanding. It is hardening, consolidating its power under a sky that offers no clouds, no shadow, and no relief. You can feel the tension of the season within the very timber of the house, which groans softly in the heat as the wood dries out, its seams shrinking until the faint smell of resin and aged sap fills the upper hallways. Water has become the most precious commodity in the territory, far more valuable than the silver coins that jingle in the pockets of the cattlemen. The creek that had run clear and full in April has dwindled to a sluggish, muddy thread, and the town pump in the square is guarded by a deputy marshal to prevent hoarding. Madame Sarah, with her characteristic foresight, had contracted during the winter to have a deep artesian well dug in the backyard, drilling through 90 feet of solid limestone until they struck a cold, sweet vein of water that never fails. This well is the true secret of her house's summer comfort. Every morning, before the sun can turn the air into a furnace, the houseboys draw dozens of buckets of this subterranean water, using it to scrub the veranda planks, to douse the heavy canvas awnings that shade the windows, and to fill the large stoneware crocks in the kitchen where the butter and milk are kept cool. The air inside the house remains remarkably pleasant, a sanctuary of shade and damp coolness that draws the town's businessmen away from their stifling offices like bees to a shaded garden. During these long, parched afternoons, the parlor assumes a quiet, almost domestic stillness that feels entirely disconnected from the dusty chaos of the street outside. The girls sit in the shadows of the pulled blinds, their light muslin dresses sticking softly to their skin, their fans moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that creates the only breeze in the room. Marie sits on the floor near the piano, her fingers idly tightening the silver strings of her guitar, while Lou reads aloud from an Eastern magazine that has arrived 3 weeks late by the overland mail. They talk in low, drowsy voices, their conversations drifting from the price of ice, which is hauled down from the mountain lakes in insulated railway cars and sold for ruinous prices, to the rumors of a new gold strike in the northern hills that might draw away the remaining labors. Sarah sits at her walnut desk, a damp linen cloth draped across her neck to stave off the heat, her ink pen scratching across the ledger as she calculates the rising cost of provisions. She knows that the dry weather has ruined the local vegetable crops, forcing her to rely on canned goods shipped from California, a logistical expense that threatens to eat into her summer profits if she does not adjust the prices at the bar. Yet, her dry wit remains as sharp as a newly honed razor, a cooling element in a world that is running dangerously hot. One afternoon, a prominent member of the new town council, a wealthy butcher named Henderson who had recently aligned himself with the moral reform faction, came into the house to demand that Sarah pay a special sanitary fee for the maintenance of the public gutters. He stood in the center of the parlor, his face red and sweating, his voice booming with a self-important righteousness as he complained that her establishment produced more waste than any other business on the avenue. Sarah listened to his tirade without moving a single muscle of her face, her gray eyes watching the sweat drip from his chin onto his silk waistcoat. When he finally ran out of breath, she leaned back in her chair, her lips twisting into a slow, ironical smile. "It is an interesting proposition, Mr. Henderson," she said softly, her voice carrying that cool, world-weary cadence that always signaled a trap. "But if we are to speak of sanitation, perhaps we should look at your own shop down the street. Only yesterday, my girls had to walk through the mud past your rear door, where the offal from your slaughterhouse has been left to rot in the sun until the flies are thick enough to choke a horse. My house produces nothing but clean soapy water and the empty bottles of your own colleagues. If the town council wishes to collect a fee for cleanliness, I suggest you start with your own apron." The other customers in the bar let out a collective roar of laughter, and Henderson retreated into the glare of the street, his reformist zeal remarkably dampened by the public exposure of his own domestic habits. The true danger of a frontier summer, however, was not the hypocrisy of the politicians or the scarcity of water. It was the constant, terrifying ghost of fire. In a town built entirely of dry pine lumber, pitch-sawn shingles, and canvas linings, a single spark could rewrite the history of the county in less than an hour. The wind, blowing hot and steady from the southern plains, was a constant threat, capable of carrying a burning ember from a locomotive smokestack or a careless kitchen hearth across 3 blocks of buildings before anyone could raise the alarm. Every saloon owner kept a row of fire buckets filled with stagnant water or dry sand near the door, but everyone knew that these primitive defenses were nothing against the red wall of a general conflagration. Sarah understood this peril with the deep, instinctive knowledge of an old campaign follower who had seen 3 different gold camps burned to the ground in California. She did not rely on luck or the vigilance of the town watch. She instituted a rigid discipline within her house that was almost military in its precision. No lamps were allowed to be left burning in empty rooms. The kitchen fires were drawn and extinguished every evening at midnight, and she personally inspected the brick flues of the chimneys every Monday morning, looking for the tiny, hair-like cracks that could allow a spark to escape into the attic timbers. She purchased 4 large copper chemical extinguishers from an agent in St. Louis, placing them at regular intervals along the hallways, and she drilled her girls and the houseboys on how to use them until they could deploy the heavy cylinders in total darkness. The necessity of these precautions became terrifyingly clear during the first week of August, an evening when the moon rose large and blood-red through the smoke of a distant prairie fire that had been burning for days in the west. The air was thick with the smell of parched grass and distant soot, a dry, electric atmosphere that made everyone's skin prickle with an undefined anxiety. The parlor was crowded with guests, railroad directors, cattle brokers, and local lawyers, all trying to drown their nervousness in Sarah's iced bourbon and Marie's lively ragtime tunes. Suddenly, the music stopped. Not because Marie had finished her piece, but because a strange, hollow sound had drifted through the open veranda doors. It was the sound of a church bell, but it was not ringing for the Sunday service. It was hitting a frantic, irregular rhythm, a desperate clanging that was immediately joined by the shouting of voices down by the rail yards. Fire! The cry rose from the street, a word that had the power to freeze the blood of every person on the frontier. The livery stable is going up. Within seconds, the parlor was empty as the guests rushed out onto the veranda. Looking down the avenue, you could see a towering pillar of yellow flame bursting through the roof of the great wooden stable 3 blocks away, its light illuminating the entire town in a horrific, unnatural noon. The dry pine of the building was burning with a ferocious intensity, the sparks rising hundreds of feet into the night sky like a fountain of gold coins, before being caught by the southern wind and driven straight down the line of the avenue, toward Madame Sarah's house. The scene in the street was one of absolute panic. Men were running in every direction, shouting contradictory orders, pulling frightened horses from their stalls, and trying to haul their personal belongings out of the shops before the flames could reach them. The town's volunteer fire company, a group of well-meaning merchants with a single hand-pump wagon, arrived at the scene, but their hoses were useless. The water pressure from the town well was nothing but a trickle, and the heat was so intense that they could not get within 50 feet of the blaze. The fire was moving with a terrible, predatory speed, leaping from the stable to the adjacent dry goods store, its red tongues licking the false fronts until the wood seemed to explode into flame from the sheer heat before the fire even touched it. Inside the house of solid wood, there was no screaming and no panic. Madame Sarah stood at the top of the veranda stairs, her black silk dress reflecting the red glare of the sky, her voice low, cool, and perfectly steady as she took command of her people. She did not try to save her furniture or her clothes. She knew that if the house went, everything was lost anyway, and that her only chance lay in defending the structure itself. She ordered the houseboys to the roof, carrying buckets of water from her artesian well and long heavy blankets that had been soaked through until they were dripping wet. She instructed Lou and Marie to manage the copper chemical extinguishers along the upper windows, ready to quench any stray ember that might shatter the glass. Clara was sent to the kitchen to keep the well pump moving, her young arms working the iron handle with a fierce, tireless energy that kept the water flowing without a pause. You must imagine the next hour as a descent into a literal underworld of heat, smoke, and noise. The roar of the fire was like the sound of a continuous freight train passing through the room, a deep, vibrating rumble that shook the crystal chandeliers and drowned out the shouting in the street. The heat on the veranda was so intense that the paint began to blister and bubble into gray blisters, and the air was so thick with black smoke that it was impossible to see more than 10 feet ahead. Sparks as large as a man's fist were raining down upon the roof, sizzling and smoking against the wet blankets that the houseboys deployed with a desperate, lung-burning courage. Twice, a small fire started on the corner of the veranda roof, and twice, the steady, systematic application of water from Sarah's well extinguished the flames before they could take hold in the cedar rafters. Sarah herself remained on the porch throughout the ordeal, her hands busy wet-clothing the white railings, her face black with soot, her eyes never leaving the roofline. She watched the building across the lane, a cheap dance hall made of green pine, catch fire and burn to the ground in less than 15 minutes, its heat radiating against her skin like an open forge. But her own house stood, a lone white island of solid wood and wet wool amidst a sea of red destruction. When the dawn finally broke, the wind shifting to the north and bringing a cool, damp mist from the hills, the fire had run its course, having consumed 4 blocks of the town's commercial district before dying out against a vacant lot of gravel. The avenue was a smoking, black sky of ruins, a forest of charred chimneys, twisted iron wagon tires, and piles of gray ash that smoldered in the morning light. The livery stable, the dry goods store, the dance hall, and a dozen small shacks were completely gone, their very existence erased from the earth. But the house on the corner was still there. Its paint was blackened and ruined, its awnings charred to rags, its windows cracked by the heat, but its frame was solid, its roof intact, and every single person under its protection was safe and unhurt. The artesian well had saved them, providing the water that the municipal system could not, a demonstration of enterprise that did more to secure Sarah's reputation in the territory than any financial transaction. As the sun rose through the smoky haze, casting a dull, copper light over the ruins, the people of the town began to creep back into the street, their faces pale with exhaustion and shock. They stood in the mud created by the fire hoses, looking at the black waste of their ambitions. Many of them had lost everything they owned, their stock, their tools, their records, and they faced the prospect of the coming winter with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Madame Sarah did not waste time celebrating her survival or counting her luck. She went inside, washed the soot from her face, changed into a clean apron, and ordered the kitchen staff to begin cooking. Within 2 hours, she had set up a relief kitchen on her front veranda, using the provisions she had stored in her cellar to feed the homeless families and the exhausted firemen. She did not charge a single penny for the food, nor did she ask about the politics or the moral character of the people who lined up at her stairs. The very same women who had gathered their skirts in condemnation only a week before were now sitting on her porch steps, weeping with gratitude as Lou handed them cups of hot coffee and Clara shared fresh bread with their children. This act of generosity was not a calculated political move, though Sarah knew it would make her position unassailable for years to come. It was the instinctive reaction of a woman who had lived her entire life on the margins of civilization, and who understood that when the wilderness struck back, the only thing that stood between humanity and destruction was the willingness to share whatever shelter you had. She moved through the crowd with a characteristic dry humor, teasing the local marshal about his soot-stained nose and reminding the bank director that his mortgage records might be gone, but his memory was surely intact, diffusing the despair of the community with the same steady hand she used to control her parlor. The local newspaper, when it managed to print an improvised edition on a hand press the following Wednesday, dedicated its entire front page to the disaster. The editor wrote a long, moving account of the fire, praising the heroism of the citizens, but he reserved his highest eloquence for the madam of the corner house. In the darkest hour of our city's trial, he wrote, his prose thick with 19th century sentimentality, when the flames threatened to engulf our entire enterprise, the residence of Madame Sarah stood like a fortress of hope, and her noble, unselfish actions in the aftermath of the catastrophe have earned her the enduring gratitude of every true citizen of this territory. Sarah read the article with a quiet, ironic chuckle, noting that the editor had forgotten to mention that his own home had been saved by the water drawn from her backyard well. In the weeks that followed, the town began to rebuild with that frantic, indomitable energy that characterized the frontier. The black ruins were cleared away in a matter of days. The smell of charred wood replaced once again by the clean scent of fresh pine lumber as new. More substantial buildings rose from the ashes. The land rush was entering its final, most mature phase. The canvas tents were gone forever, The greenwood shacks were disappearing, and the first brick blocks were being constructed with iron fire shutters and stone foundations. Madame Sarah's house underwent its own restoration. She hired a crew of painters to scrape away the blackened crust and apply 3 fresh coats of brilliant white paint. She replaced the cracked window panes with fine plate glass from Pittsburgh, and she ordered new canvas awnings of green and white stripes that gave the building an air of prosperous, established elegance. The house was no longer a symbol of the wild frontier. It was a monument to survival, a fixture of the community that had been tried by fire and found to be solid. Inside, the routine returned to its familiar pattern, but with a subtle change in the atmosphere. The web of influence that Sarah wove around her establishment had become an iron cage. The town could no longer pretend that she was an outsider, a moral pestilence to be tolerated in the dark. She had saved their children, she had fed their merchants, and her well had provided the only water that stood between their ambitions and the ash heap. When she walked down the avenue now, the respectable women did not turn their faces away. They nodded their heads in quiet, reluctant greeting, acknowledging a debt that could never be recorded in any bank book, but would remain as long as the town itself stood against the golden prairie. Sarah sat at her desk on a late August evening, the wind finally blowing cool from the north, bringing the first faint whisper of the coming autumn. She opened her ledger, her pen tracing the columns of names and figures that represented the reconstruction of the town. She had lent money to 3 different merchants to help them rebuild their shops. She had taken a share in the new livery stable, and her safe was full of new deeds and mortgages. She had won her long war against respectability, not by conforming to its rules, but by being more reliable, more generous, and more solid than the society that condemned her. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, its deep chime rolling out through the open window over the new brick avenue, she closed the book with a soft, satisfied sigh. The oceans of grass were silent once more, but within the walls of her house, the history of the West was being written in gold, wood, and survival. Part 6. The Golden Harvest and the Iron Grid. If you sit out upon the wide veranda during the quiet, amber hours of a late October afternoon, you can feel the entire territory shifting its weight, settling into a deep, heavy stillness that is entirely different from the frantic energy of the summer months. The relentless heat that had turned the avenue into a dusty kill has finally broken, replaced by a crisp, northern breeze that carries the sharp, sweet scent of frosted sagebrush, curing hay, and the distant, smoky fragrance of clearing fires from the valley farms. The vast ocean of prairie grass, which had been green in the spring and golden in the July sun, has now turned a deep, burnt copper color, a shifting, rustling canvas that seems to absorb the pale autumn light, until the horizon looks like a line drawn in charcoal against a sky of pale violet ribbon. The town below has entered a period of sober, industrious maturity. The frantic clatter of the early boomtown has subsided into the steady, mechanical rhythm of a permanent city. The old pine shacks that had survived the summer fire are being systematically dismantled, their places taken by 3-story blocks of red brick and gray granite, their iron window frames and heavy oak doors signaling a community that is no longer guessing about its future. The streets are being graded and paved with cedar blocks to keep the autumn rains from turning the avenue back into a swamp, and for the first time, you can walk from the railroad depot to the courthouse steps without once getting your boots soiled by the raw frontier clay. You can smell the seasonal transition within the very plaster of the house, which has cooled down after the long furnace of the summer, its rooms filled now with the rich, comforting aromas of the harvest. Madame Sarah has spent the past 2 weeks preparing her cellars for the long winter ahead, converting her financial profits into the tangible wealth of survival. If you were to follow her down the narrow wooden stairs into the cool, stone-lined basement beneath the parlor, you would see rows of heavy oak shelves groaning under the weight of hundreds of glass jars. Green beans preserved in vinegar, sweet yellow corn packed in brine, dark jars of wild plum jam collected by the homesteaders along the river bottoms, and sacks of northern potatoes that smell of rich, damp earth. Against the far wall stand rows of iron hoop barrels filled with salt pork, dried beef, and fine wheat flour hauled from the new mills in Kansas, alongside crates of imported apples wrapped in tissue paper to keep them fresh until the new year. This underground empire is the true foundation of her house's winter security. Sarah understands that in a territory where a single blizzard can close the railroad tracks for 3 weeks, true power belongs not to the person with the largest bank account, but to the person whose kitchen never runs out of bread and whose woodpile is stacked higher than the eaves. In the parlor above, the atmosphere has grown soft, reflective, and deeply comfortable. The crimson wallpaper with its intricate gold leaf patterns looks warmer now in the pale afternoon sun, the heavy velvet curtains drawn back just enough to allow the amber light to pool across the polished mahogany floors. The girls have adjusted their routines to the rhythm of the season, the evening finery augmented by thick woolen shawls of emerald and deep sapphire that they drape across their shoulders as they sit near the parlor stove. They spend their afternoons in a quiet, companionable industry that mimics the domestic life of the great homes in the East. Marie sits by the window, her fingers moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern as she knits a heavy pair of winter stockings for the cook's child, her guitar resting silently against the velvet sofa. Lou is busy with a basket of old linen, cutting the worn sheets into neat square patches that can be used for bandages or cleaning rags, her soft voice humming a slow, traditional melody that she remembers from her childhood in Ohio. They do not talk of the changes that are turning their wild boomtown into a respectable city, for they already feel the pressure of the new order in the way the townspeople look at them from the wooden sidewalks. Madam Sarah sits at her walnut desk, her silver hair catching the amber light from the window, her fingers moving with a slow, deliberate precision as she reviews the changing nature of her accounts. The ledger columns are different now. The colorful names of the early days, the horse thieves, the wild Texas cowboys, and the desperate gold seekers, have largely disappeared from her pages. In their place are the clean, elegant signatures of the new elite. Bank auditors from Chicago who have come to verify the land titles, corporate attorneys representing the railroad monopolies, and federal inspectors sent from Washington to oversee the division of the Indian territories. These men do not arrive with gold dust in their pockets or pistols in their belts. They carry leather briefcases filled with parchment documents, and they pay for their entertainment with neat bank drafts drawn on institutions in St. Louis and New York. They do not seek the wild, rowdy revelry of the old canvas palace. They want a quiet parlor where they can smoke their expensive Havana cigars, sip Sarah's best Scotch whiskey, and discuss the reorganization of the territorial courts without fear of being overheard by their competitors. Sarah has adapted her house to this new clientele with her characteristic dry wit and sharp economic intelligence. She has replaced the loud, rhythmic ragtime sheet music on the piano with the more conservative waltzes of Strauss and the classical nocturnes of Chopin, creating an environment that feels less like a frontier saloon and more like a private club for the gentlemen of the new order. She understands that these corporate pioneers are just as lonely and anxious as the railroad laborers who preceded them, but their anxieties are of a different kind. They are not worried about freezing to death in a sod house or being killed in a dispute over a mule. They are terrified of losing their positions in the corporate hierarchy, of being outmaneuvered by a rival syndicate, or failing to meet the expectations of their directors back east. They seek her house not for a wild escape from the law, but for a sanctuary where they can drop the heavy, exhausting performance of professional respectability and speak their minds to a woman who judges no one and remembers everything. Her dry humor is her primary tool for managing these self-important men, who often forget that their legal authority means very little within the walls of her house. One afternoon, a newly appointed federal judge named Harrison, a man who had been sent from New England to enforce the new federal statutes against land speculation, came into her office to demand that she turn over her records regarding a particular railroad land transaction. He was a thin, rigid man with a high collar and an air of absolute, unyielding moral superiority, and he spent 15 minutes lecturing Sarah on her civic duty and the long arm of the federal government. Sarah listened to his sermon with an air of sleepy, patient attention, her fingers idly smoothing the lace trim of her apron. When he finally paused, his face flushed with his own eloquence, she looked up, her gray eyes clear and completely untroubled. "It is a grand speech, Judge Harrison," she said softly, her voice carrying that low, world-weary cadence that always made men feel suddenly exposed. "And I am sure the folks back in Massachusetts would be deeply moved by your devotion to the law. But before we speak of my records, you might want to look at the register of the Grand Hotel down the street. Only last night, your own chief clerk spent the evening in my parlor, discussing that very same land transaction with the director of the Southern Syndicate over a bottle of my best champagne. If the federal government wishes to investigate leaks in its department, I suggest you start with the man who carries your own briefcase." Harrison's face turned the color of a winter turnip, and he left the office without another word, a small demonstration of her defensive strategy that ensured her ledgers remained in red and her safe remained locked. The true story of the autumn, however, was not the arrival of the federal judges or the consolidation of the corporations. It was the changing lives of the women who had built the house with her. Consider the perspective of Lou, who had spent 18 months saving every dollar of her share of the house profits, recording her earnings in a small, private notebook that she kept hidden beneath her mattress. She had not spent her wages on the expensive silk dresses or the diamond rings that the other girls favored. She wore the same conservative gingham day dresses, mending the lace cuffs until the fabric was thin, her eyes always fixed on a future that lay far beyond the red light district. With Sarah's guidance and the assistance of Marshall Miller's dummy corporations, Lou had quietly purchased 300 acres of prime bottomland along the river valley, land that had been cleared by a discouraged homesteader who had moved back to Indiana after the summer fire. She had hired a local builder to construct a modest frame house and a large barn on the property, and she had spent her afternoons purchasing farming tools, seed wheat, and a small herd of dairy cattle from the incoming settlers. She was preparing to leave the life of a sporting woman behind, transitioning from the margins of society to the very center of the new agricultural economy. When the day of her departure arrived in late November, the sky gray and heavy with the promise of the first snow, there was no grand celebration or dramatic farewell. Lou packed her single leather trunk with her few clothes, her books, and her private journals, her movements slow and deliberate as she looked one last time around the small second-floor room that had been her sanctuary for over a year. She came down the grand staircase into the parlor, where the other girls had gathered to see her off, their faces a complex mixture of genuine joy for her success and a deep, secret sorrow for their own choices. Marie gave her a small silver locket that contained a strand of her own hair, while Clara presented her with a basket of dried lavender from the backyard garden to sweeten her new linen closet. Madame Sarah stood by the front door, her face calm and expressionless, though her gray eyes were uncharacteristically soft as she looked at the young woman she had rescued from the depot platform. She did not offer her a sermon or a collection of maternal advice. She simply handed her a sealed envelope containing the final deeds to the river property and a substantial bank draft to cover her winter expenses. "You have played your hand well, Lou," Sarah said softly, her voice dropping into a quiet, respectful cadence. "You came to this country with nothing but an empty pocketbook and a broken spirit, and you are leaving it as a landowner with your head held high. Do not look back at this house with shame, child. It was the bridge that carried you across the river. Now go and build your farm, and if any of your respectable neighbors ever give you trouble, you tell them to come see the major on the corner." Lou wept as she embraced the older woman, before stepping out onto the veranda and climbing into the waiting carriage that would take her to her new life. The girls watched from the window until the carriage disappeared into the gray mist of the avenue, a moment of profound transformation that demonstrated the true purpose of Sarah's empire. It was not a trap to hold women in degradation, but a fortress that allowed them to buy their freedom from a world that offered them no other choices. The dry humor that Sarah brought to her daily management was a shield against the increasing isolation that was beginning to affect the house. The departure of Lou was the first crack in the tight-knit family that had survived the Canvas City and the Midsummer Fire. The town was becoming too large, too anonymous, and too rigid for the old personal loyalties to hold sway. The new residential neighborhoods that were rising on the hills behind the courthouse were filled with families who knew nothing of the early days, who viewed the White House on the corner not as a sanctuary that had saved their city from destruction, but as a shameful vestige of a wild past that had to be hidden away behind high fences and municipal zoning laws. This cultural shift was reflected in the career of Marie, whose music was undergo its own transformation. The old frontier ballads, the songs of lone cowboys, tragic miners, and abandoned homes were no longer popular with the new corporate guests. They wanted the sophisticated, modern tunes that were popular in the theaters of New York and Chicago, the light opera melodies of Gilbert and Sullivan, and the complex, nervous rhythms of the early ragtime that was beginning to filter up from New Orleans. Marie, with a natural musical intelligence, adapted quickly, her fingers mastering the new, syncopated patterns with an ease that astonished the theater musicians who visited the house. She began to write her own compositions, short, brilliant piano pieces that captured the frantic, mechanical energy of the growing city. The clatter of the locomotives, the rattle of the telegraph wires, and the steady thud of the brick factories. These pieces were published by a music house in St. Louis under a male pseudonym that Sarah had arranged for her, and within a few months, her compositions were being played in parlors and concert halls across the Midwest, earning her a steady income that was completely independent of her work in the house. Yet, despite her success, Marie's face grew increasingly melancholic as the autumn advanced. She would spend hours sitting at the grand piano in the empty parlor, her fingers idly tracing the ivory keys without making a sound, her eyes fixed on the frosted glass of the windows. She told Sarah that she felt like a ghost in the new city, a creature of the canvas and the dust who did not belong in the world of brick and law. "The town has lost its heart, Sarah," she said one evening, her voice low and tight as she watched the gas lamps flicker down the avenue. "In the early days, when we lived in the tents, every man was our neighbor. We knew their names, we knew their stories, and we shared whatever we had. Now, the streets are paved with stone, but the people are made of iron. They look past us as if we are already dead, and they only come here to hide from their own shadows." Sarah did not contradict her, for she knew that Marie had stated a profound truth. The frontier was dying, its wild, creative chaos being replaced by the rigid grid of modern industrial civilization. The White House on the corner was no longer the center of the community. It was an island being slowly surrounded by a rising tide of respectability that would eventually submerge it entirely. But Sarah was not a woman to waste time in useless nostalgia. She focused her energies on the immediate, practical reality of her household, tending to the quiet, grounding presence of Clara, who had found her own unique fulfillment in the service of the house. Clara's harvest had been a triumph of quiet industry. Her backyard garden, which had been drenched in water from the artesian well during the summer fire, had produced an abundance of winter vegetables that filled the cellar shelves. She had also cultivated a large bed of medicinal herbs, sage, thyme, horehound, and wild chamomile, which she dried and stored in small linen bags to treat the winter ailments of the household. She had become the literal housekeeper of the establishment, her quiet, efficient movements ensuring that the linen was always white, the floors always polished, and the meals always hot and nourishing. The bond between the old madam and the young girl had grown deep and wordless, a relationship based on mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it took to survive. In the evenings, after the girls had gone upstairs to prepare for the night's business, Clara would bring a tray of tea and fresh biscuits to Sarah's office. They would sit in the candlelight, the grandfather clock ticking steady in the hole, sharing a quiet half-hour of companionship that was the only true rest Sarah allowed herself during the day. They did not speak of the future or the past. They talked of the practical management of the house, the price of coal, the quality of the new flour shipment, or the condition of the roof shingles, finding a deep, stabilizing comfort in the simple details of domestic order. When the winter finally arrived in earnest, the first heavy blizzard coming down from the north in early December with a howling fury that drifted the avenue with 6 feet of white powder, the house of solid wood was ready. Its cellars were full, its woodpile was stacked high, and its walls were seasoned against the cold. The grand parlor was warm, the stone fireplaces throwing a bright, cheerful light over the red wallpaper and the mahogany bar, the crystal chandeliers rattling softly in the wind that screamed around the eaves. The guests who gathered in the house that night were different from the rowdy crowd that had celebrated the opening of the Canvas Palace a year before. They were quiet, dignified men in expensive woolen suits, their hats neatly brushed of snow by the houseboy, their voices low and professional as they sat around the card tables. Marie sat at the piano, her music no longer a wild frontier song, but a brilliant, modern composition that seemed to match the mechanical precision of the clock in the hall. Sarah sat at her desk, her ink pen moving steadily across the pages of her ledger, her gray eyes clear and completely serene as she recorded the evening's profits. She had survived the land rush, she had beaten the politicians, and she had built a fortress that had bought freedom for her girls and safety for herself. The old, silent ocean of grass was gone, replaced by a grid of steel and stone, but within the walls of her house, the spirit of the pioneer still held sway. A monument to a time when a woman with a cool head and a steady hand could look out over the wilderness and write her own destiny in the margins of the world. Part 7. The Iron Frost and the Architecture of Permanence. If you stand at the base of the grand mahogany staircase during the deep, frozen midnights of January, when the wind down the main avenue screams like a lost creature from the high mountain peaks, you can feel the heavy, quiet weight of time settling into the very grain of the pine joists. The town outside has finally completed its long metamorphosis from clay and canvas into stone and iron, its streets lined with 3-story brick blocks that look solid enough to withstand the end of the world. The old rail yards have expanded into a massive, soot-blackened maze of coal sheds, engine houses, and iron switches that hum constantly with the vibration of incoming freight, a relentless mechanical pulse that has permanently shattered the ancient silence of the plains. But inside the house of solid wood, the air remains thick with a warm, motionless history, a sanctuary where the frantic progress of the 20th century is kept strictly at bay by the heavy velvet curtains and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. The red wallpaper, once so bright and shocking against the green timber of the frontier, has faded into a deep, regal wine color, its gold leaf patterns catching the dim light of the embers like the half-forgotten embers of a campfire. You can smell the absolute isolation of a western winter in the very breath of the rooms. It is a scent composed of dry wool cloaks drying by the hearth, the sharp, medicinal tang of pine tar used to soothe the girls' winter coughs, the bitter dark sediment of chicory coffee simmering on the kitchen stove, and the cool, metallic scent of frost creeping across the plate glass windows. The landscape beyond the veranda is a blinding, featureless ocean of white, a desert of snowdrifts so immense that they have buried the fences and the roads, turning the newly established county lines into a joke shared between the wind and the stars. The men who come through the heavy front door now do not carry the raw, wild energy of the early land run. They arrive with their shoulders hunched against the killing cold, the breath freezing into white masks upon their woolen mufflers, their boots caked in hard, gray ice that clatters against the pine floorboards like gravel. They are older now, their faces lined by years of anxiety over bank investments, cattle prices, and the changing laws of a territory that is rapidly outgrowing its pioneer origins. Madame Sarah sits in a high-backed chair behind the walnut desk, her silver hair catching the amber glow of a single brass lamp, her fingers moving with the slow, deliberate patience of a weaver over the pages of her seventh ledger. The columns of text are no longer a simple record of whiskey barrels and gold dust. They have become a complex map of the town's financial underbelly. A history of mortgages held, municipal bonds purchased, and private loans extended to the very same developers who publicly call for the eradication of the Vice District. She has watched the old outlaws fade into the earth or the penitentiary. She has seen the wild marshals replaced by neat, uniformed policemen who carry silver whistles instead of shotguns, and she understands that the frontier she had tamed is being quietly strangled by the very respectability she helped to finance. Yet, her dry-wit remains her most reliable shield against the coldness of the world, a subtle, world-weary humor that allows her to look upon the changing town with the detached amusement of a queen who knows her fortress is secure. Consider the perspective of someone like Marie, who has spent nearly 8 years within these walls, her beauty changing from the sharp, bright radiance of youth into a softer, more melancholic elegance. She no longer plays the raucous tunes of the cattle camps or the sentimental ballads of the railroad crews. She has spent the long winter evenings studying classical arrangements brought from the East, her fingers moving over the ivory keys of the grand piano with a technical precision that fills the parlor with a deep, cathedral-like resonance. The customers sit in the shadows, their glasses untouched, listening to her music with a quiet, reverent attention that would have been unimaginable in the early days of the Canvas City. They see in her not merely a sporting woman, but a living monument to their own lost youth. A remnant of that brief, beautiful era when the land was open, the rules were unwritten, and every man believed he could carve a fortune out of the grass with his own 2 hands. The changing times have brought a new kind of institutional conflict to the house, a pressure that is far more difficult to manage than the fire or the financial panic. The town council, now dominated by the wealthy merchants and the wives of the professional class, has passed a series of strict segregation ordinances, designed to confine all houses of amusement to a narrow, muddy lane behind the rail yards, a place the locals call the deadline. The reform leagues have petitioned the circuit court to revoke Sarah's property deeds, arguing that her grand White House on the corner is a public affront to the moral character of the new municipal center. Sarah has watched these developments with quiet, ironical detachment, refusing to panic or seek the protection of the local politicians, for she understands that the machinery of respectability is always driven by the engine of private necessity. One cold January afternoon, the city attorney, a young, ambitious lawyer named Sterling who had been elected on a platform of total moral renewal, came to her office to deliver the official notice of eviction. He stood before her desk, his new leather boots squeaking against the rug, his voice carrying the sharp, administrative arrogance of a man who believes the law is a tool to be used for his own advancement. "You must understand, Madame Sarah," he said, his fingers tapping the crisp paper document with an air of finality. "The town has grown up. We are no longer a frontier camp. We have built a high school, 3 churches, and a public library. Society cannot tolerate the presence of your establishment on our primary avenue. You have 30 days to remove your business behind the tracks, or the marshal will be instructed to board up your doors." Sarah did not look at the paper, nor did she raise her voice to argue with his definition of society. She reached into the deep drawer of her desk, pulling out a small, faded leather notebook that had remained locked away since the 2nd year of the land rush. She turned the yellowed pages with a slow, deliberate scrape of a fingernail until she found the section she was looking for. "It is a very precise law, Mr. Sterling," she murmured, her voice carrying that soft, world-weary cadence that always made the younger men feel suddenly uncertain. "And I am sure the ladies of the League are very pleased with your diligence. But before you call the marshal to my doors, perhaps we should look at a transaction from the autumn of '89. A time when your own father was a struggling land speculator who had lost his entire capital in the wheat failure. He came to my tent, Mr. Staling. He sat in my parlor, wept like a child, and borrowed $5,000 in solid gold coin from my safe to pay his taxes and keep his family from the poorhouse. I have the note right here, signed with his own hand, and I also have the deeds to the 3 city lots he gave me as security. The very same lots where your new high school and library currently stand. If you choose to evict me, I will be forced to foreclose on those properties tomorrow morning. And I suspect the town council will be very interested to learn that their new temple of knowledge is owned by Madam from the dead line. Sterling's face turned the color of the winter sky outside, his breath catching in his throat as the absolute vulnerability of his position became clear. The grand architecture of respectability that his family had built was revealed to be nothing but a frame house resting entirely on the gold Sarah had earned from the transients. He stared at the signature in the notebook, his hand trembling as he reached for his hat, the legal arrogance vanishing instantly in the face of a woman who held the true title to the town. I believe, Sarah added with a quiet, dry chuckle, that we can find a way to table that ordinance for another year. And perhaps you would care to tell your colleagues that my house pays its municipal taxes on time, which is more than can be said for half the merchants on the avenue. Sterling left the office without another word, his retreat silent and absolute, a victory that Sarah recorded with a soft sigh as she locked the notebook away, knowing that she had bought another season of peace for her girls, but understanding that the wall of her defense was growing thinner with every passing winter. The true sorrow of the season, however, was not the hypocrisy of the law. It was the steady, inevitable departure of the old pioneers who had been the foundation of her world. In early February, during a week when the blizzard had completely cut off the railway line and the telegraph wires were down, old Marshall Miller passed away in his small cottage near the jailhouse. He had been the one who had kept the peace in the early Kansas City. A man who had used his authority not to oppress the weak, but to maintain a rough, practical balance between the wild elements and the developing town. He had been Sarah's friend for a decade, a partner in a dozen hidden transactions that had shaped the geography of the county, and his death felt like the final closing of a door on the old frontier. Because of the weather and the political shifts in the town, the new authorities refused to grant Miller a public funeral, burying him in a hurried, private service in the frozen earth of the cemetery hill, with no one in attendance but a few aging deputies and the minister of the Reformed Church. The town leaders wanted to forget him, for his presence was a reminder of that raw, violent past that they were trying so desperately to erase from their history books. Madam Sarah did not allow his memory to be buried so cheaply. On the night after his funeral, when the storm had cleared to reveal a massive, star-filled sky that looked like a sheet of black ice, she organized her own memorial service within the walls of the house. She closed the bar to the public, turned off the chandeliers, and lit a single row of white candles along the top of the mahogany bar counter. The girls gathered in the parlor, dressed in their finest black morning gowns, while Marie played a slow, majestic dirge that seemed to rise from the very floorboards. Sarah stood at the head of the room, holding a glass of Miller's favorite Kentucky bourbon, her face calm but her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. She did not deliver a long, pious sermon. She spoke of his character with that dry, world-weary wit that he had always appreciated. He was a terrible politician, she told the quiet room, her voice carrying a deep, resonant gravity. He never learned how to lie with a straight face. He never made a fortune on a town lot, and he always gave his last dollar to some broken-down teamster who couldn't pay his livery bill. But he knew how to hold a town together when the mud was deep and the guns were loose. He was the only man in this territory who understood that you cannot build a clean house if you are busy pretending the dirt doesn't exist. Let us drink to the old Marshal. May his sleep be as quiet as the prairie used to be. The women drank in silence, the notes of the piano fading into the roar of the wind outside, an act of remembrance that did more to honor the true history of the West than any monument the city council would ever build. This loss marks a turning point in Sarah's own internal architecture. She begins to spend more time in her upper hallway, looking out from the window at the great stone courthouse that now dominates the square. She sees the electric street lamps flicker on in the twilight, casting their harsh, white glare over the brick sidewalks, replacing the warm, flickering oil lamps of her youth. She realizes that the town has become a machine, an administrative organism that operates by numbers, codes, and property lines, leaving no room for the personal, face-to-face arrangements that had allowed her to survive. The oceans of grass have been completely conquered, divided into square homesteads by thousands of miles of barbed wire that hums in the winter wind like an iron cage. The silence is gone forever, replaced by the continuous, distant roar of the factories and the clatter of the stockyards. Yet, inside the house of solid wood, she continues to maintain a sanctuary for the human soul. Clara has grown into a mature, steady woman who has taken over the daily management of the household. She handles the accounts with the same precision Sarah had taught her. She supervises the servants with a calm, even-handed authority, and she has turned the kitchen into a legendary center of frantic hospitality, providing meals for the travelers and the lonely clerks that make them forget the bleakness of their boarding houses. She is the future of the house, a woman who has learned how to navigate the margins of respectability without losing her integrity or her strength, a living testament to Sarah's belief that a woman can carve out her own destiny if she possesses a cool head in a protected space. When the night comes, the house assumes its traditional, glittering persona for a few hours longer. The crystal chandeliers are relit, the fire in the hearth is stoked until the room is filled with a rich, golden warmth, and the sound of the piano drowns out the mechanical hum of the rail yards. The leaders of the town, the developers, the lawyers, the judges, continue to slip through the side door, their hats pulled low against the frost, seeking the comfort, the safety, and the absolute discretion that only Sarah can provide. They sit in the velvet chairs, their bodies relaxing as the warmth of the room thaws the iron frost from their joints, their conversations turning on the grand future of their state. Sarah sits at her desk, her ink pen moving with a slow, steady rhythm across the final pages of her ledger. She has balanced the accounts for another year, her fortune secure in the banks, her properties protected by the secrets she keeps locked in her safe. She has won her long war against the changing frontier, not by fleeing from the advancing civilization, but by becoming its secret foundation, the anchor that held the community together when the wind was cold and the law was nothing but an illusion. As the grandfather clock strikes midnight, its deep, resonant chime rolling out through the frosted window panes into the dark winter night, she closes the book with a soft, satisfied smile. The Old West is dying, section by section, brick by brick. But tonight, the house is warm, the music is sweet, and the ledger is perfectly balanced. The wind picked up, driving a fresh sheet of dry snow against the veranda railings, a soft, whispering sound that seemed to carry the voices of the early pioneers across the frozen avenue. Sarah stood up, turned down the brass lamp, and walked to the window, looking out one last time at the dark dome of the courthouse. The world was changing, fast and cold, but within the walls of her house, the history of the West would remain solid, true, and full of warmth, as long as the wood held together and the light stayed bright. Part 8. The Fading Horizon and the Final Ledger. If you close your eyes now and let your mind drift backward through the long, slow accumulation of the decades, past the solid brick banks, past the iron streetcar tracks, and past the steady, electric hum of the modern telephone wires, you can still find that original, clean line where the wooden sidewalk ended and the great, silent ocean of prairie grass began. The turn of the new century has arrived not with a sudden dramatic roar, but with a quiet, irreversible settling. a creeping weight of respectability that has paved over the old mud lanes with dark, crushed stone, replaced the chaotic canvas palaces with multi-story hotels of gray granite, and transformed the raw, wild territory into a neat, law-abiding landscape of tax records, property titles, and municipal charters. The frontier that had once seemed as infinite and untamable as the sky itself has been cut into tidy, fenced rectangles, its ancient sod turned over by thousands of modern steel plows until the memory of the wild sagebrush is nothing but a phantom scent carrying on the northern wind. But hey, on the prime corner lot that had once been bought with a handful of raw gold coin during the madness of the land run, the house of Solidwood still stands. Its pine timbers seasoned by 40 winters of mountain frost, its white paint weathered to a soft, silver-gray patina that looks less like a blemish and more like the honorable scars of a long, victorious siege. You can feel the profound, comforting weight of completion within the quiet hallways as the late autumn twilight begins to drain the color from the sky. The air inside no longer carries the sharp, anxious perfumes of the early boomtown days or the frantic, chemical smell of the great midsummer fire. Instead, it has settled into a rich, deeply satisfying aroma that whispers of safety, permanence, and memories. It is a scent composed of dark molasses cake cooling on the kitchen counter, aged leather ledges that have been handled by 3 generations of frontier leaders, the clean, sharp smoke of dry applewood logs burning down to white ash in the parlor hearth, and the soft, dry dust of old silk curtains that have shielded the rooms from the glare of the western sun for a quarter of a century. The light in the main parlor is low and golden, cast no longer by the flickering kerosene lanterns of the camp, but by small, frosted electric lamps that glow with a steady, amber warmth, throwing soft, long shadows across the faded crimson wallpaper where the gold leaf patterns still catch the light like distant stars in a midnight sky. For Madame Sarah, who now sits in her high-backed velvet chair by the upper window, the passage of the years has been a process of shedding the temporary anxieties of the world to assume a position of absolute, unassailable authority. Her silver hair has turned to a brilliant, snowy white, arranged still in that elegant, regal crown that had once intimidated the Texas cattlemen and the corporate bankers alike. Her hands, though lined and spotted with the ink stains of a lifetime of accounting, remain perfectly steady as she rests them upon the polished walnut arms of her chair. She looks down at the street below, watching the occasional motor carriage rattle past the depot, its mechanical cough a strange, metallic intrusion into the quiet evening air. She does not feel any bitterness toward this new, modern world that is slowly erasing the traces of her youth. She views it with her characteristic dry wit and world-weary humor, understanding that civilization is merely a thin, polite coat of paint applied over the raw clay of human nature, and that no matter how many banks they build or how many laws they pass, the basic hunger for warmth, companionship, and a place to leave the weapons of the world behind will always remain the same. If you look closely at the room around her, you can see that the torch of the house has been quietly, seamlessly passed to a new generation. Clara now stands at the walnut desk in the office, her movements carrying the same calm, even-handed precision that Sarah had taught her during the hard winter of the panic. She has grown into a magnificent woman of business, her face reflecting the steady, grounded strength of someone who has looked into the dark corners of the frontier and found her own value. She manages the estate, which now includes 3 brick commercial blocks, a share in the county water works, and a dozen residential cottages, with an intelligence that has earned her the silent, fearful respect of every lawyer in the state. She has maintained the old codes of the house with an absolute devotion, ensuring that the sheets remain clean, the liquor remains genuine, and the discretion remains as total as the grave. She is the true architecture of permanence, a living proof that a woman can navigate the margins of polite society and build an empire that the world cannot easily tear down. Marie and Lou have long since moved into their own comfortable retirements, their names recorded in the early pages of the ledger with the gold titles of their survival. Marie had taken her savings and purchased a beautiful cottage in the hills near the river, where she spends her afternoons teaching the parlor guitar to the daughters of the very same merchants who had once gathered their skirts to avoid her on the sidewalk. They do not speak of her past, for her wealth and her dignity have made her respectable in a way that no sermon could ever achieve. Lou had gone west to California, her pockets full of the gold Sarah had helped to save, her letters arriving twice a year to speak of orange groves, blue oceans, and a life spent entirely on her own terms. They were the drift logs of a changing continent that had managed to find a safe harbor within the walls of the White House, their lives a testament to the fact that the frontier was not just a story of outlaws and lawmen, but a crucible where the forgotten could rebuild their souls from the dust. The ultimate irony of the town's development is displayed every evening in the characters who continue to occupy the velvet chairs of the parlor below. The sons and grandsons of the early pioneers, the young lawyers, the bank clerks, and the politicians of the new century, gather under the crystal chandeliers, their broadcloth suits immaculate, their language checked at the door with a polite, modern obedience. They believe they are living in a completely civilized society, a progressive world that has left the primitive vices of the land rush behind. They do not realize, or perhaps they choose to forget, that the very foundations of their banks, their schools, and their libraries were purchased with the gold coin that Madame Sarah had carted through the snow during the Great Panic. They do not know that their properties are secured by the deeds that sit in her iron safe, or that their family reputations are protected by the code of silence that has been maintained within these walls for 30 years. Sarah watches them through the open parlor doors with a quiet, ironical amusement. One evening, the new mayor of the city, a pompous young reformer named Albright, the grandson of the hardware merchant who had once tried to shut her down, came into the house to attend a private dinner organized by the directors of the railway. He spent an hour speaking of his plans to pass a new moral code ordinance that would finally erase the red light district from the municipal map, his voice booming with the self-important righteousness of a man who has never known the hunger of a canvas camp. When he walked past Sarah's chair on his way to the dining room, he stopped, his head bowing in an instinctive, confused gesture of respect that he could not fully explain to himself. Sarah looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and deep beneath the snowy brows, her lips twisting into that slow, world-weary smile that had once silenced his grandfather. "It is a very ambitious ordinance, Mr. Mayor," she said softly, her voice carrying that low, comforting cadence that seemed to fill the room like a lullaby. "And I am sure your voters are very proud of your virtue. But before you print your code, you might want to ask your father about the winter of '92. A time when the bank was locked, the frost was deep, and your family table would have been completely empty if this house had not carried your grandfather's tab for 5 months without a single penny of interest. Respectability is a very fine coat, my boy, but it is always sewn with the thread that the frontier provided." Albright's face turned a sharp, brilliant crimson, his reformist speech dying in his throat as the deep, unrecorded history of his own house rose from the pine floorboards to meet him. He went to his dinner in total silence, and the moral code ordinance was never heard of again, a small, final victory that Sarah noted with a quiet chuckle as she turned the page of her book. As the midnight hour approaches, the music from the parlor below begins to soften, the lively modern rags fading into a slow, familiar melody. It is the same waltz that Marie had composed during the long autumn of the Sparks, its notes rising through the floorboards like a ghost from the canvas palace, carrying the strange, beautiful loneliness of the early plains into the crowded rooms of the 20th century. The customers sit in the shadows, their voices dropping into a quiet, reverent murmur as the music weaves its old spell of safety and remembrance around them. They feel, if only for a few minutes longer, that they are back in that raw, open world where the horizon was infinite, the choices were dangerous, and the human heart was the only law that mattered. Madame Sarah closes the heavy leather book before her. It is the 8th ledger, its columns completely filled with the neat, elegant script that has tracked the financial and moral equation of the West from the first tent pole to the final brick. She rests her hand upon the cover, the dark leather cool against her skin, feeling the immense, silent weight of the secrets she has carried for so many years. She has balanced the accounts for the last time. Every debt has been settled, every loan recorded, and every memory safely anchored within the solid wood of her house. She has outlasted the outlaws, she has outsmarted the politicians, and she has tamed the wilderness with an understanding of human nature that was far more powerful than any gun or plow. She stands up from her chair, her movements slow but dignified, and walks out onto the upper balcony to take one last look at the western night. The sky is vast, clear, and cold, a deep indigo dome filled with thousands of steady, diamond stars, the very same stars that had guided her freight wagon across the green ocean of grass when the territory was nothing but a promise. The town below is quiet now, the electric street lamps casting their white circles onto the empty avenue, the mechanical roar of the rail yards settling into a distant, rhythmic hum that sounds almost like the breathing of a great animal at rest. The silence of the prairie has not been destroyed. It has merely retreated to the upper air, hanging over the brick buildings like a vast, indifferent blessing. You can still feel that old spirit if you know how to listen to the late hours of the Old West. It is there in the slow vibration of the grandfather clock in the hall, in the deep resonance of the piano keys as the final chords fade into the dark, and in the quiet, comforting knowledge that no matter how much the world changes, the stories of the margins will remain, written in the gold, the wood, and the survival of those who knew how to live entirely on their own terms. Sarah turns back from the balcony, her face calm and beautiful in the starlight, a queen who has completed her long watch. She steps inside the hallway, closes the heavy wooden door upon the horizon, and turns down the final lamp, leaving the house of solid wood to its well-earned, eternal sleep.